Welcome, and thank you all for joining the Market Surveillance Committee meeting. If you'd like to ask a question throughout today's call, you can please press the raise hand icon at the bottom center of your WebEx screen. With that, I'll now go ahead and turn the call over to Dr. Ben Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you, Silas. And just checking, you can hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
That's terrific. So Ben Hobbs, as Silas mentioned, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee, here with Scott Harvey and Jim Bushnell, the other two members. And we're here to talk today about market power mitigation in the West-wide market EDAM and scarcity pricing. And these are two very meaty topics. And the agenda on those topics will be that James Friedrich will be giving an overview of the general approaches, emphasizing the market power mitigation aspects, but also talking a bit about scarcity pricing. And then Dr. Quinn Zhao will be showing some data and some simulations of the results of different market power mitigation procedures. I gather there are 8 variants, so there'll be plenty to chew on there. Following those presentations, Scott Harvey will be making a presentation on market power mitigation, Jim Bushnell on some general considerations in scarcity pricing and where the heck do we get the values that we would need for that. And then finally, Scott will return to talk further about scarcity pricing. I have no doubt that we'll easily fill up the 3 hours. So in addition, the people that I've just mentioned with us are other ISO staff, including Amelia Blanky, Danny Johnson, Brenda Marquez, and I think, no, I've also got Becky Robinson, and I think that's everybody. Did I skip anybody? Okay, that's a complete roll call. So before we get to the staff presentation by James and Quinn, we will, as usual, open up the mics for public comment on any issue, although if it's the issues that we're talking about later, if you could hold comments until later on, if that's possible. But at any rate, any comments or questions, be very glad to hear them. So Silas, can you check the phone line, see if anybody is queued up?
If you would like to speak under public comment, you can please press the raise hand icon at the bottom center of your WebEx screen. And at this time, we do not have any hands up in the comment queue.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll have plenty of discussion later. You won't disappoint us. You never do. Okay, so James, this is all yours. Let's hear about market power mitigation and then a bit about scarcity.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben, for the introduction. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to start off our discussion today on BAA level market power mitigation. Just as a refresher, the Price Formation Enhancements Initiative has 3 different topics, 2 of which we'll be talking about today. BAA level market power mitigation is 1, scarcity pricing is 2, and fast start pricing is 3. Right now, the latest straw proposal was produced in August 2025 that was dealing with the topics of BAA level market power and scarcity pricing. And so those are the subjects of our discussion today. So we'll start here with market power mitigation. We can go to the next slide. So the purpose of what I plan to do for the discussion is essentially to set the context for what we're thinking about and the sort of the chronological history over the initiative's history, what the discussions have been like, and how they've evolved to give good context, and then hopefully set up Quinn after me to share some analysis with you all. So for BAA level market power, it really starts with at least the policy discussion that we're having starts actually in the EDAM space where the EDAM policy decided to extend the market power mitigation framework that exists already in the Western Energy Imbalance Market to the EDAM. And so that consists of two separate market power mitigation functions, separate but similar functions. The first is local market power mitigation, which addresses market power issues that can arise from congestion within balancing areas. And then BAA level market power mitigation, which is the subject of our discussion, addresses market power issues that may arise from congestion between balancing areas through WEIM transfers or in the future EDAM transfers. And so in the EDAM space, the stakeholders and the ISO discussed the existing BAA level market power mitigation procedures and sort of agreed that they found the existing process outdated. The BA level market power mitigation process that's present in the WEIM today was conceived back in 2015 and 2016 when the Market Surveillance Committee, when the WEIM was first forming, and only had, PacifiCorp and the CAISO as initial participants, followed shortly later by Nevada. And the procedures, for BA level market power were appropriate back then when there was only, a very small handful of balancing areas participating in the market. But now with 20 plus entities in the WEIM and several committed to the future EDAM, CAISO and stakeholders agree that the existing process needs to be updated. And so that was deferred. That decisions around how exactly the BA NPM process would be updated were deferred into the price formation initiative. And so here we are. Next slide, please. So we'll start the chronological history here with an issue paper done in summer of 2022. And we'll talk a little bit about the introduction of the grouping approach that the CAISO put forth back then. So the primary issue with the current BAA level NPM approach is that the test is evaluating the balancing areas in the WEIM in isolation whenever they're import transfer constrained from the CAISO. So essentially, the real-time market knows when other BAs are import transfer constrained from the CAISO because their marginal energy costs are higher than the CAISO's. And the CAISO BA's marginal energy cost is the default competitive reference price for the BA NPM procedures today. So the issue here is that the test limits the identification of potentially pivotal suppliers specifically to those within the tested BAA. And the problem with that is that you may have a group of BAs who are unconstrained from each other. And the idea is that the current test, by testing the BAs individually, may produce false positive mitigation because the test is only considering the suppliers within the BA itself. But in reality, those suppliers may actually be competing with other suppliers in other balancing areas in an unconstrained region to serve load in that region. And so the grouping approach was formed to allow the market power mitigation process to have visibility in how these unconstrained groups are forming and assess the competitiveness of that region instead of the individual BA. And so we call that the grouping approach, and that's going to be a term you'll hear many times in today's discussion. Next slide, please. So fast forward to 2024, the ISO published what we call a discussion paper, which is a new sort of paper term that was born out of the new working group stakeholder process. But essentially, the discussion paper is intended to sort of summarize the discussions we were having with stakeholders at that time, sort of document and be able to move forward with next steps on these discussions. And in these discussions, we considered the expansion of the scope beyond just the grouping approach to several other topics. One was whether or not the grouping approach itself should test the CAISO BA in the test for the WEIM and the EDAM. Currently, the CAISO BA is not tested in the BA market power mitigation approach. It is sort of by default assumed competitive and also sets the competitive reference price for BA level mitigation for the rest of the market. And so any BA that's grouped with the CAISO or has marginal energy costs lower than the CAISO are not tested in today's world. And this was something that we thought about. Second was to consider mitigating only pivotal suppliers, or maybe more appropriately, a subgroup of suppliers rather than all the suppliers in a failed BAA. So in today's test, when a BAA fails the competitiveness assessment, all of the resources within the failed BAA are subject to market power mitigation. But considering this would mean that the market power mitigation process would consider subjecting only a subset of resources to mitigation and identifying how exactly that process should work. And finally, there was discussion in the working groups about an impact test. And an impact test, that term impact test comes from sort of adopting the language of conduct and impact style mitigation, where an impact test is essentially looking at the price impact that a potentially uncompetitive bid has on the broader market prices, and chooses only to mitigate that resource if the price impact of that bid is significant or above some sort of predefined threshold. And so we considered that in the stakeholder process as well. Next slide, please. So then pre-straw proposal now, we're in early 2025. The ISO produced some data analysis that it presented to stakeholders and then separately to the Market Surveillance Committee in May of 2025. And what this data analysis was showing is that without the CAISO BA included in the test, that the grouping approach was having a significant impact on the frequency of mitigation in the WEIM, which is, what we hypothesized would happen and is directionally the result we were hoping for. But then in a later analysis, when the ISO analyzed the grouping approach with the CAISO BA included, the results showed that the CAISO BA was frequently failing the competitiveness test, especially in peak summer evening hours, and sort of dragging the other BAs down along with it. And so we also observed other BAs pass rates dropping pretty sharply as well. So we presented those findings to the MSC, and from that meeting, the MSC suggested that perhaps the results that were a little head scratching were driven by flaws in the three pivotal supplier test. One of which is that the three pivotal supplier test that's applied today assumes that affiliates could and would basically withhold all of the capacity it possibly could. And the MSC argued that, well, for some affiliates are load serving entities and have retail load obligations. And for those types of affiliates, it would be economically irrational for them to withhold the supply beyond what's needed to serve its own load, because there's sort of an offsetting cost to any additional revenues they would gain from the supply side by exercising market power would be more than offset by the increase in cost it would pay to buy power from the market and serve its own load. And so the MSC, as a result of that meeting, the MSC urged the ISO to consider sort of the net position of affiliates and their retail load obligations when calculating the capacity they can withhold in the test, and also to double down on the idea of trying to mitigate, pivotal suppliers only, or this idea that was termed small fish swim free, which basically tries to identify a process with which the mitigation process would not mitigate really small affiliates or resources that are not, not possible to have a price impact on the local price. And so those are things that the CAISO looked into in the formation of our SHRAP proposal in August 2025. And we'll move to that slide next. So in the August 2025 SHRAP proposal, we incorporated this feedback from the MSC to hopefully fix or address some of the underlying issues of the 3PS, 3 pivotal supplier tests that were sort of exposed in the data analysis. And so the August SHRAP proposal, as it relates to market power mitigation at the BA level, more or less formed around 3 different ideas. One is that the CAISO produced a formal grouping algorithm that does include the CAISO BA in the test. Second is that the proposal considers the affiliate's load serving obligation when calculating its withholdable capacity. And we'll talk more about that in the coming slides and also in Quinn's presentation after mine. And then third, to mitigate only pivotal suppliers rather than all suppliers within a failed group, and to come up with some algorithms to identify who those pivotal suppliers are and limit the mitigation to them. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is, before I go on, that is intended to be some context setting, a short walk through memory lane of the history of the BA level MPM discussion that we've had over the last several years. So I'll just take a moment to pause to see if there's any questions before I move on to a slightly different subject.
James, it'll come up a little later, but what was the upshot of the discussions about the impact test? I'd forgotten that was part of the scope you guys considered, because it doesn't seem to make it into the draft final proposal or the draft proposal. Right.
Yeah. So in the working group discussions, the CAISO considered that a potential additional step. Well, let me back up. So the CAISO's default market power mitigation procedures are inherently what we'll call structural market power mitigation, which is essentially that where the CAISO's processes are identifying areas with which there may not be much competition, and therefore the potential to exercise market power may exist. And there are other forms of market power mitigation that exist in LMP markets, notably a conduct and impact style test, which several of the Eastern markets have. And as part of the working group discussion, there was some chatter about, well, maybe the ISO should consider sort of converting completely to a conduct and impact style mitigation framework, to which the ISO basically said, well, we might not have to tear down and rebuild the entire market power mitigation construct. Maybe there's ways that we could sort of insert flavors of what a conduct and impact style mitigation does within the existing design of the, our existing market power mitigation design. And what that looked like at the time was essentially that the CAISO may consider an extra step whereby you are identifying, you're identifying areas through the 3 pivotal supplier test of potentially lack of competition, and then you are evaluating bids relative to reference prices. But that's as far as the test goes. And we consider, well, maybe you want to do a third step where you say, okay, well, for those bids that you flagged that are in potentially uncompetitive areas and are bidding above the reference price, maybe you can add a quote unquote impact test that measures what the impact of those bids, if they were reduced down to the reference price, would actually, what would that do to the, in this case, since it's BA level market power, we're talking about the impact only on the marginal energy cost. So if you reduce those bids down to the reference price, how would that change the marginal energy cost? And if the change in price is below some threshold, maybe you say, okay, well, we don't mitigate those bids. And so that was discussed in the working group. And ultimately, the working group did not move forward with that suggestion, and the CAISO did not propose anything about that in the straw proposal. But it was discussed, and so that's some history there.
Okay, yeah. I mean, and we're gonna, discuss this further, so maybe we can kind of circle back. I just was curious because, yeah, that's what I would call the structure and impact test, I guess, where you're sort of adding the impact onto the existing kind of framework.
Right.
And I just was curious if maybe we can come back to it, what sort of the logic was about why or why not to add that third step. But let's defer that. Thanks.
Right. Okay.
Scott? Take care. Scott, I think I heard your throat clear, but
No, I was muted. I figured I'll talk about it later. There's no need to,
okay.
talk about it now. But
so James said, I was wondering. Quinn's going to be considering 6 or 8 variations, combinations of with LSO, without LSO, with CAISO in there, without it, and then an extended or revised version and so forth. Was there a consensus in the working group that just based on theoretical, just thinking about it, that as some combinations just make more sense, that we really should, for example, get consider the load obligation. These are not all equal proposals, equal proposals, and we're just going to look at the impacts and choose one based on the impacts. There's some expectation that some make more sense. And I was wondering if any sort of consensus emerged from the discussions about just a priori, before we look at the quizzes, which of those seems something that's more acceptable to people, more sensible.
Right. I would say that the theory behind the grouping approach seems to make a lot of sense to the majority of our working group participants. The theory behind this idea of considering load serving obligations seemed to be well supported. There was some feedback in the straw proposal about the specific methods with which one might calculate this, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so we think we've put forth some substantial improvements on that aligns with that perspective. I think that the working group also, in theory, generally supports the idea of limiting the mitigation to a subset of suppliers and not necessarily all suppliers in the failed BA by default. But again, were some discussion about exactly how that methodology plays out that we're taking into account. That won't be discussed. We don't have any prepared remarks today about that, but certainly in the future we'll want to talk about that. So then the last part leaves, which is really the major, I would say the major outstanding issue for this policy is the treatment of the CAISO BA in the test, I would say is split among stakeholder groups, where you'll have some that argue the CAISO should be included and some that argue the CAISO should not be included. So I would say that that any variation, the variation that matters, I think, most to our working group participants is CAISO included or CAISO not included, I think is the biggest question. And these other ones, I think, are more theoretically supported and just trying to nail down the specific details.
Okay, so on some of the issues, there's a convergence, and differences in the results won't be important to that choice. You mentioned that there's some small variants of the approaches that that will be looked at, and how one decides among them is something we'll have to discuss. But in the including the CAISO versus not, are there a set of theoretical reasons on both sides, and there are advantages to both sides, or is it come down more to certain practicality? I mean, clearly you get different results, but we're not looking, we'll choose the method that gives us the results we want. We want some sort of a reasonable justification for it that makes some kind of sense in terms of, yes, this is the one is going to be more likely to have to avoid false positives and false negatives. Is there any sort of consensus on including versus not including CAISO, or are there theoretical arguments mustered on both sides that that we actually such that more thinking needs to be done, or it really is going to depend on Quinn's results somehow? Yeah, I'm. The reason I'm asking is this is when we see Quinn's results, I want to know how to. What sort of weight we put on that versus a priori theoretical arguments that, yeah, people, market players in the CAISO have as, they're as much of a concern as market players anybody else, and we should include them, or somehow they're different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, and again, I'm going to be summarizing others' views. So I would encourage, if I do a poor job of this and you're on one side or the other, to come off mute and let your voice be heard. But please. I would say in generally that the folks that are pro mitigation for the CAISO BA would say something along the lines of, the three pivotal supplier test is the method that we use today to identify a quote unquote problem, meaning that there's a potential lack of competition and the potential exercise for market power. We apply that standard to everybody else except for the CAISO BA to identify if there's market power issues to be addressed. And to them, they don't see any reason why the CAISO shouldn't be consistently treated in that process. In addition to that, one may argue that if insofar as you believe the three pivotal supplier and RSI test the CAISO conducts, or the market operator conducts on the BAs is a valid test, then you might say, well, insofar as CAISO is structurally competitive, that means they won't fail the test. That means they won't be mitigated. Therefore, they're not subject to harm. So if you strongly believe that the three pivotal supplier and RSI test is providing outcomes that demonstrate, something valuable, then there's this sort of, well, it doesn't hurt the CAISO to test itself because you're only going to mitigate it when it's subject to the same, when it's non-competitive the same way everybody else is non-competitive. Now, the other side might say, well, wait a minute, the CAISO is structurally different in a way that matters, that is relevant for market power mitigation, which is that the CAISO BA has access to supply on its interties outside of WEIM and EDM transfers that arguably the three pivotal supplier and RSI test does not fully account for. Meaning that I can explain if needed, but the three pivotal supplier and RSI test, which you'll see an equation on the next slide, does consider the cleared imports net imports on the CAISO's interties outside of the transfers as part of the supply stack. But arguably, the suppliers within the CAISO BA are competing to serve CAISO's power balance constraint with beyond just the cleared imports, but all of the imports that are offering on the CAISO's ties are essentially providing competitive pressure, and the three pivotal supplier tests may not account for that. And so you could say, well, either change the test to account for it, or you could say, which I think Scott will argue, is that, okay, well, is that hypothesis true? If a hypothesis is not true, then perhaps the CAISO should be seeing evidence of actual harm being done, because we haven't been testing ourselves for the last decade. And if the imports are providing that competitive pressure, and we're not seeing a lot of instances of actual exercise of market power on the VA level in the CAISO, it might be fair to assume that that's okay. So you leave the three pivotal supplier test as it is. The CAISO is differently situated, and it does get sufficient competition from its interties, and you're not seeing that that harm done. And so these entities would say, I think, that from a theoretical basis, but they would also say, show us the harm, show us there's a problem in the CAISO BA, which I think I won't belabor because Scott will talk more about this. Show us the harm that something wrong is happening before you change the test. So hopefully that's a fair summary of the different viewpoints, Ben. Let me know if there's any follow-up questions.
I had one. So yeah, we will discuss this sort of what I would consider lack of evidence of whether there's a problem with system market power in a minute. But the argument about competitive pressure over interties, is that really a special consideration for CAISO, or don't other BAs also have some element of that? I'm sure it varies from BA to BA, but is there something there that really is unique to CAISO?
Well, I think CAISO, I think it comes down to the price sensitive imports, and the CAISO, of course, is the player within the market that's going to have by far the highest volume of that. And I think there is, obviously there are going to be intertie transactions in the other BAs that are happening, but mostly through, self-schedules. And those things are factored into the test, which I'll show you on the next slide what the equations look like. But it's the imports that are providing price sensitive offers that are essentially saying, what one could say, okay, if a supplier within the CAISO BA attempts to withhold, they're not just competing against the other suppliers within the CAISO BA, they're competing with the marginal offer on the intertie.
Right. So you're saying it's the imports we don't take
exactly.
because they were priced above the market clearing price, but in a counterfactual, if there was withholding, there would be more of them.
Right. Exactly.
And yeah, I mean, I guess that's maybe easier to observe mechanically in the CAISO because of the way its market clears. But if we think about sort of like a multi-day dynamic, I'm not sure that is. I'm sure the CAISO has more of it, but I would imagine every BA, would attract import interest if its prices got pretty high relative to others.
Yeah, and then the follow-up question then becomes, from a policy perspective, if you agree with the view that the price-sensitive intertie offers to the balancing area provides competitive pressure the test doesn't account for, you move yourself into one of two directions. You'll say either try to account for it in the three pivotal supplier test. I can tell you we've had a lot of discussions about this internally, and it's very difficult to do it properly. Or you might say, okay, well, we absent a lack of demonstrated harm inside the CAISO, we then probably should assume that any BA in the Western market, in the WM and EDAM, that enables intertie pricing or intertie bidding should also get be treated similarly. And you'd have to debate, like, if BAX2 joins the EDAM in the future also enables intertie pricing on their border, do you also exempt them from the BA level test? If you believe that that's the only structural difference between CAISO and the others that matter, then probably you should. And so those are
James.
I
mean, there is a difference for the other BAs, because if they're constrained, then there's no imports coming in the 5-minute market or the 15-minute market, and hourly markets can't provide balancing, because part of this is to price the balancing services that the balancing area operator provides. Remember, that's part of going back 10 years. That was what we were talking about originally, is they wanted under their tariffs to be able to price the imbalanced energy based on Western EIM prices. And when they're constrained, the only pricing is their own generation, because they're different in that respect. So the issue would be if a CAISO is constrained on all its interfaces, and what people are talking about now is, well, maybe, one thing they're talking about is, well, maybe there's a situation where they're not constrained, from other, what you started talking about. They're not constrained they're constrained from the CAISO, but they're not constrained from other people. And maybe that's enough competition so they can still have market-based rates for imbalances. Right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and the mismatch of the hourly price-sensitive interties and the 15 and 5-minute balancing in the WEIM is a tricky one to resolve. And if you were going to try to want to incorporate some of this into the test, you have to resolve some of those issues, and that's challenging.
Right.
So I'm projecting future discussions. We don't have all the answers or even all the questions yet, but just trying to give you a sense of where things could go. Okay, should we do a little math?
Can I just double check? I don't see anybody queued up, but Silas, is there anybody who would like to, the audience would like to ask a question at this time or make a comment?
Yep, just for anybody who's recently joined us, you can press the raise hand icon at the bottom center of your WebEx screen if you'd like to make a comment. I'm not seeing any hands up in our queue right now.
Okay, great. This is the part I've been waiting for. Love the math. Let's go, James.
All right, let's see if I can do this right. Okay, so we're going to be comparing equations before and after the LSO approach is applied. And why this matters is because I want to talk to you about how the CAISO I'm going to preview with you and with the stakeholder groups that are listening to the call, how the CAISO is thinking about how actually to estimate the load serving obligation number. But in order for that to make relevant sense, one must also know, well, how is load serving obligation actually factored into the test? So Quinn is going to do much more of this in her presentation than I do, but I just wanted to give you a general sense so that you can put those pieces together. So we'll start at the top. There's before load serving obligation. So these are the existing formulas. And we'll start with this thing called withheld capacity. It is the difference between the maximum amount of supply a unit can offer or can possibly reach within the interval that's being evaluated, minus the minimum supply the unit can reach within the unit evaluated. So if this was the 15-minute market, the maximum amount of supply they can reach up to minus the minimum amount of supply they can reach up to. Sometimes these supply minimums may account for things like self-schedules or other physical operating limits on these units. So the withheld capacity, notice that these don't have subscripts, and the next set does. So withheld capacity is used, and it's organized. Every single supply resource has a withheld capacity. They are aggregated up to the affiliate level, an affiliate being, for market power purposes, affiliates are essentially a group of financially connected scheduling coordinators. So we do market power mitigation by affiliates, group them by those that are financially together. And we use the withheld capacity calculation to identify who are the 3 largest suppliers, okay? And once you have the 3 largest suppliers, then you move into the RSI, because the 3 largest suppliers become separated from the rest, and they're called potentially pivotal suppliers, or PPS. And the resources that belong to potentially pivotal suppliers are labeled with a subscript J. The rest of the resources and the affiliate groups are labeled for this interval as fringe competitive suppliers, FCS. And their resources are denoted with subscript I. And so what the RSI test is doing at a balancing area level is essentially saying, if the 3 largest suppliers in the balancing area withheld all their supply, all their withholdable supply, is there enough residual supply to meet demand? So therefore, if the RSI ratio is greater than or equal to 1, the BA is deemed competitive, it passes. If the RSI is strictly less than 1, the RSI fails, the BA's resources are subject to mitigation. So let's look at these terms in the RSI equation. First, you have the maximum supply output from the fringe competitive suppliers as sort of the available competitive supply the market has access to, plus imports. In this case, the way this equation is written out, imports and exports are separated in the numerator and denominator. That's just easier, it relates better to Quinn's analysis than grouping them into a net import term. But anyway, imports at the top, it's supply. For the CAISO BA specifically, imports actually come from two different sources. Imports come from dynamic WAIM transfers or EDAM transfers in the future, and intertie, cleared interties on the hourly ties. All the other BAs, the term import is only populated by the import transfers. Okay, and because other BAs, because the other BAs will only have a net import or a net export via the transfers, the import might be 0 or the export might be 0. It would be a net import term. Okay, and then finally, this last term here are the sum of for the potential pivotal suppliers of the non-withholdable supply. Okay, so if whatever amount of generation that essentially the pivotal suppliers must output is included here in the supply term. And then the bottom term would be the load plus the exports. So for CAISO, that would be cleared. Yep.
Oh, you may have, I may have dismissed this, but yeah, the SJ min. So is that more of a physical kind of min run? And also, I guess in real time, there would be some ramping considerations there that would be factored into that. But nothing to do with like a day ahead purchase obligation when we get to real time or anything like that. It's just the physical, you can't possibly reduce your output that quickly sort of consideration.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And in IFM, actually, the term withholdable capacity is sort of a misnomer because the IFM assumes perfect. Withholdable capacity makes a lot more sense in real time where you have discrete movements from an initial point. In IFM, you're essentially assuming the entire offered schedule is the difference between the max and min. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you don't know the initial condition at that time where they're going to be. Okay.
One question
before I move.
Go ahead.
Yep. Go ahead.
On the imports, when you're doing this for when you're grouping, it seems like the imports shouldn't include the dynamic transfers, right? Because that's from other people that's other supply that's coming from other people's, or you're going to put everybody's dynamic transfer exports going to someone else in the group?
That's a great question. So what happens in the grouping approach is that within the imports and exports within the group are netted to 0. Only imports and exports from the group in or out of the group will count in this equation.
Okay. Yep.
That's good clarification.
Thanks.
Okay, so now in the bottom, we'll see how these equations change now with the load serving obligation added in there. So withholdable capacity becomes different. And we'll start with the term on the right, where you have this max function of either the minimum supply or the load serving obligation. So what this means is that if the load serving obligation, this is sort of setting the floor, resetting the floor of what they would withhold. So obviously, if the load serving obligation is less than the amount they can actually physically withhold, then it's irrelevant. But if the load serving obligation is larger than the physical minimum they can withhold, then the load serving obligation becomes the floor with which withholdable capacity is determined. And then we also have this, the max of 0 or this term is just to mean that we don't want the number to be negative. So it's a non-negative number. The withholdable capacity must be greater than or equal to 0. So if you have a really large load serving obligation, even larger than you may have a load serving obligation that's larger than your actual supply maximum, in which case would otherwise produce a negative number if that max of 0 was not in there. Okay, and then into the RSI, we didn't rewrite the whole equation, but just this term for the potentially pivotal suppliers, where before it was just the minimum supply of the potentially pivotal suppliers. Now it is the same concept where the load serving obligations of those potentially pivotal suppliers becomes the floor, can potentially be the floor of their withheld capacity if it's greater than their physical withheld capacity or the SJ min term. And then last thing, a small note there that we have the minimum of the supply max or this term because if the load serving obligation is so large to exceed even the capacity, the maximum capacity of these suppliers, then we don't want the number to be their withholdable or their capacity to be more than the maximum of these units, because otherwise you would get negative numbers and you would essentially get you would be crediting as supply more than the actual maximum supply of the potentially pivotal suppliers, which doesn't make any sense. I hope this is helpful context so you'll know how in the NPM test these things are being applied. And then in the coming slides, we're going to talk about, well, how do you determine the LSO number? Any questions before I move on?
I think we're good, and I don't see anybody in queue from the phone lines, although anybody has a question or comment right now from in the audience, please raise your hand. Let's proceed.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in the August 2025 STRAW proposal, we sort of said, well, there's a lot of different ways we can do it, and we sort of presented what I'll call a conceptual methodology just to prompt a discussion. And we sort of said, well, the easiest way we could do it is we would create sort of a set of load serving obligation profiles by affiliate that would be using historical information. In this case, the information would be previous year's meter data. And you can break it down any way you want. You can break it down by hour, season, day type. In this case, day type meaning weekend or weekday, or also I think holiday is grouped in with weekday or weekend. So you could have, a sort of a data set off to the side of all these load serving obligations profiles by affiliate. And so if you're in hour ending 14 in the summer season, on a weekday, you have a number for that that specific time frame that's based on what the number was last year, essentially, as a way to estimate it. And so, okay, we threw out this approach. It's conceptually quite easy to do and understand. The proposal did sort of self-identify its limitations, and then these limitations, I think, were sort of jumped on by the stakeholder comments, which basically there are 3 potential flaws. Obviously, using previous year's information is completely ignoring the real-time conditions. And so in that sense, the accuracy of whether what your load was on this, last summer, hour ending 14 on the weekdays, averaged up, how accurate might that be for this year is questionable. But also that because they're an average, it would be an average value. An average, of course, is going to underestimate the load serving obligation during a present heat wave or any extreme condition, which means you'll overstate a supplier's incentive to withhold in those cases. On the other hand, it will overestimate your load serving obligation on presently mild days. So it's historical, it's an average. Both of those things will, have questionable accuracy. Second, that without any additional intervention, the process would fail to otherwise capture load growth or migration from the load serving entity. And so if there was significant load growth or migration, from additional, let's say additional data center, or you had, CCA migration or something like that, that would happen where your last year's load is no longer representative of this year's load, then we would have to develop some sort of process to, figure all that out, and that would be difficult to do. And then the last part is that there's a lag between sort of the acceptance of settlement quality meter data, and as far as I can understand, it's possible, not likely, but possible that settlement quality meter data for, let's say, December of the previous year may not be available till April of the next year. And so because of that lag, when you're starting the market in January 1st of 2020, whatever, and you want to use the previous year's meter data, you already are working with a potentially small or potentially not a full data set, and you'd have to have processes to update the data set and sort of as you go. So this lag could potentially also, affect the accuracy of the estimate. You may not even have access or ability to have the relevant meter data on time. So
James,
I'm
I'm confused by
Yep.
that, because wouldn't you have the data for January through April, by April, because that's more than a year old? That'd be way more than 5 months, right?
I guess if you decided that you wanted to segment by season, then yeah, you would have January through April of the previous year in time to segment it by season. But if you decided not to segment by season and you wanted to just do it by hour, or then you would potentially not have all that information. So that's true.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't seem like a big deal, because we probably wouldn't want to use winter data for summer or summer data for winter. So,
Right.
I mean, maybe, I guess, maybe if we wanted to use December for January and February, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess in this case, winter would not be sort of the meteorological definition of winter, but you would have maybe quarterly instead of, pure season, something like that.
Or you could use the prior, not use the December that was a month ago, but use the December that was 11 months ago or 12 months ago, and then the prior season.
Yeah, so as you'll see, I don't think there's going to be a way to completely avoid the meter data. The preview of our new proposal still uses meter data, but it's used in a different way. And so some of these questions we still might have to grapple with, but it'll have less impact, we think, on the actual estimate of the LSO in the future.
Also, I mean, if depending on how long a data set you could have here, you could work in things like weather or other obvious sort of predictors of what load might be.
Yeah. You could certainly think of additional ways to segment the data than just the ones that we listed here that are more sort of time profile based. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so there's one punchline here of this preview is that we think that it's reasonable to have different methods of identifying load serving obligation between the day-ahead market and the real-time market. And we'll start with the day-ahead market here. We think that, the clearest measure of what, an affiliate must serve tomorrow is what's actually scheduled and cleared in the day-ahead market. And I want to try to be meticulous about using words like physical load in the day-ahead market and, must serve. These are shortcut terms, because I think one could argue, well, day-ahead markets are financial markets. You're doing, you're hedging load more than procuring load, and all the load that's, actually serving is sort of happening in real time. Notwithstanding, the day ahead what clears the day ahead market is a good representation of sort of the load that you're at least financially obligated to serve in the next day. And so we could essentially say for all the, you can take all of the scheduling coordinators in a group and aggregate up their load serving obligation to the affiliate level and say, okay, that is your load serving obligation. You would take these values from the market power mitigation pass, because obviously you need, you couldn't do it from the actual ISM because you need the outputs of the NPM pass to serve as an input into the NPM process. So the only way to do that is to take them from the NPM pass itself. And then one question that's come up a little bit in the stakeholder comments is, what would you do about net virtual demand? And we kind of wanted to see if the MSC had any opinion or thought about this at this time, because, one could say, well, net virtual demand in the market ISM model is completely fungible with load. Financially, it incurs similar obligations as load. And the incentive to withhold, where we're arguing, well, you don't have incentive to withhold beyond what's needed to serve your own load because you're buying this power at the inflated price. That seems also to connect with your virtual position, because if you have a large virtual position, you may also not have the same incentive to withhold. However, at the same time, day-ahead market load bids are done at a different granularity than virtual demand. So you can bid virtual demand at a node, but actual load is done at an aggregated level. And so you might be concerned about, well, you might be able to, an affiliate might be able to use this difference in granularity to their advantage by finding positions on the system that net virtual demand has a low impact, and, yada, yada, yada. So that may be one thing to think about. Of course, affiliates, anybody can use virtual demand bids for reasons that are completely financially unrelated to, hedging their load. And so there may be a question about if you're overlapping different financial incentives on top of each other, maybe it doesn't make sense. And the last part is, of course, well, if you're giving load serving obligation credit to affiliates based on their net virtual demand, you could be giving load serving obligation credit to an affiliate who really doesn't have any retail load. You could have no scheduled load and a large net virtual demand position, and you would get load serving obligation credit in the NPM test. And is that, sort of aligned with the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish? So thought I'd present some initial thoughts on this and see if the MSC or even stakeholders would like to weigh in on that.
A couple ones, just sort of thinking aloud. I was trying to think through in real time whether this creates, so ignoring net virtual demand would only create a bias towards more mitigation. Is that right? That there isn't a way to sort of use virtual demand to get less mitigation? Because I guess you're already basically using zero as the LSO currently. So,
well, it's the other way around. Remember that a higher LSO means you have less. So clearing net virtual demand will increase your load serving obligation and decrease your it decreases both your position in the 3 pivotal suppliers. So you could actually bump yourself out of the 3 pivotal supplier group. But it will also, if you do become a 3 pivotal supplier, it will impact the actual RSI competitiveness of the BA itself.
Yeah, no, I guess maybe I agree with you. Maybe I misspoke, but yes, I was just so ignoring net virtual demand will only increase the propensity to mitigate.
Right.
So one doesn't have to. There isn't a way to sort of undo. On your nodal versus DLAP sort of point, I seem to recall there are some clawback sort of provisions, but maybe they're limited to CRRs having to do with taking virtual positions, and I'm just wondering if there's some whether virtual demand is considered. I guess it's not considered at all in the local market power mitigation because net position isn't considered at all in local market power mitigation at this point.
Yeah, so I should have been prepared to answer this question. I know that virtual offers are not mitigated, and it's escaping me in the ISM how a net virtual position, whether or not that's included as supply or not. I think not, but maybe Amelia knows, or somebody
whether
else can
it
help
has
me with that question.
RSI in any way.
Yeah, excuse me. The clawback that Jim was referring to, Dr. Bushnell was referring to, is for the CRR
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
payments. That's not associated with our market power mitigation.
But if you, yeah.
Gonna say, you know what, I've been thinking a bit about if you overbid your load, that's just like virtual demand, right? And
Mhm.
you're basically making it look like you have less supply available in the market, and therefore you might not be a pivotal supplier because you don't have that much to withhold. But on the other hand, it would reduce the amount of fringe supply you'd have. Right? So your fake supply, if you overbid your load, you'd reduce the amount you had to withhold, but on the other hand, you'd increase the amount of load that needs to be met, so that you'd increase the likelihood of failing. So it doesn't seem, my thought at this point is it's not a strategy for circumventing the test, but I think we need to think that through a bit more.
Mhm.
Does that argue for my first instinct was it makes sense to include this because it is a financial obligation. I guess a conservative approach would be to not include the net virtual because it is, but that I don't know if we want a more conservative approach, especially for system level mitigation. But yeah, I mean, if you just think about the logic for including cleared scheduled load, it's the same logic as virtual load because you basically are on the hook to pay for it in real time, and you're going to just not have any incentive to try to increase prices in real time if you have this very large load position. And I guess what you just pointed out, if you are an actual load serving entity, you can sort of do it just by bidding your load instead of through virtual demand if you really were trying to use your virtual demand somehow strategically to avoid mitigation. But yeah, it's not clear that you have a benefit from it because you're avoiding mitigation by buying a whole lot of energy, and
Right.
and so you wouldn't want to raise prices.
Yeah, another thing to remember too is that there is no virtual bidding enabled in the EDAM yet, outside of the CAISO yet, so that would also, at this time at least, limit the impact of whether or not that term is included.
Right. And I'm thinking about, what about EIM? Is there any kind of, consideration of base schedules or something like that? Or it's just, this would just not be a consideration for the non-EDAM EIM entities?
Yeah, the virtual part would not. But yeah, Quinn can talk more about how the base schedules and the non-participating resource supply in the EIM gets handled in the test.
Okay.
All right. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to offer you now 3 different categories of what to do with the real-time market load serving obligation. And the reason why it gets trickier in real time is that because for the day-ahead market, in order to bid load, you have to be a scheduling coordinator. And to be a scheduling coordinator requires you to have settlement quality meter data and metering requirements that are sort of specific to the scheduling coordinator. And why that matters is that, remember that market power mitigation is done by an affiliate at an affiliate level, and affiliates are basically just groups of scheduling coordinators. And so absent information to tie meters to scheduling coordinators, you don't have a way to sort of connect, from a BAA, how to distribute the BAA's metered load between different players within it. And so I'm going to have to offer you 3 different paths. They're not competing paths. They're actually three that are together as a package, depending on where the WIMBA finds themselves, okay? And so the simplest case, of course, is that the WIMBA has one affiliate, and most WIMBAs have one affiliate, okay? So for this group of BAs, it's pretty simple. You apply to the affiliate the BAA's load forecast for the relevant interval in real time. And the assumption here is that all of the BAA supply is being coordinated and offered by the WIM entity. And so for symmetry, all of the BAA's load is going to be, given credit to in the NPM test to the WIM entity in this case. So you would just take the real-time market forecast for the interval for the BA level. We already have that information. You just say, okay, that is the affiliate's load serving obligation in this case. Okay, and then maybe I'll go through all 3 and then we can come back to them as they'll make more sense as a package. So let's go to the next case. Okay, so now the next case is, okay, you're a WEIM entity, you have multiple registered affiliates, and you're in the EDAM. So first, the and in EDAM part matters because if you're not in the EDAM, we will have metering information at the BA level. All of the WIM settlements and metering information is done at the BA level. So if you're not in the EDAM, we don't have that information to be able to parse out. But if you are in the EDAM, you've now opened up opportunities where third-party loads or embedded utilities within the BA can become their own scheduling coordinators in the EDAM, which has metering requirements associated with it, so that now the ISO has the ability to break out the meter data, not just in the BA, but also from affiliate to affiliate. And so this multiple affiliates and in the EDAM assumes that you're going to be, the CAISO has the information that it needs to calculate what we'll call the historical percentage share of the affiliate's load over the BA. And so you're going to split you're going to take the BA forecast, which is the most accurate measure of load within the BA that we can have access to, and you're going to split it based on a predetermined allocation of historically what that affiliate's load in the BAA is relative to the entire BAA. Okay, so in a simple example, if you've got one affiliate that serves 50% of the load historically, one affiliate that serves 50% of the load historically, you're going to take the real-time demand forecast and split it in half. You get 50%, you get 50%, or 40, 40, 20, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And you can use these same distinguishing factors like hour, day type, season, whatever combination you want but instead of doing that for load serving obligation number, you're doing that. The output is now a percentage of the load. So it's much more accurate than the previous one because you're actually scaling this based off the real-time demand forecast of the BAA.
So the downside would be if an LSE is serving like just a data center or, to take an extreme, if it's like got 2 or 3 just pure base load demand or something than just the load shape. So the only weakness here is if the load shape of one LSC is dramatically different than, say, the system. And
Right.
you gotta I 714 data don't do this, so it's a really hard thing to get visibility on in general.
Yeah, so many of the weaknesses that we explained on the previous slide still carry over, but in their magnitude is, of course, is smaller because you're
At least adjusting to the actual demand and the
exactly.
estimate of actual demand. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, let's do the last slide and then we'll come back to talk about all three of them. Okay, so now we have a big question. So we want to give load serving obligation credit to affiliates who are not in EDAM. And there are multiple of them within a BAA. So all we have is the BAA information. What do we do with those affiliates? Well, you have to think about a workaround. So the workaround that we thought about is as follows. One, of course, if the affiliate level metering exists, the affiliates or the BA or the EIM entity themselves has information that can be made available to the ISO, then we can generate processes to accept that information and basically put them in the previous category to say like, okay, the market doesn't, our processes don't generate this information, but insofar as we can get equivalent information directly from the entities themselves, then we'll take it. And then this is a non-issue. But what if that's not possible? One way we think that we could do this is you could approximate the affiliate's load serving obligation based on their supply share within the balancing area. So you know based on the participating and non-participating resource shares of all the affiliates within the BA, how much of the total BA supply is served by affiliate A, B, and C. You could say, well, if they're all load serving entities, you could roughly estimate their size based on their the supply associated with them. But the problem becomes that some of these BAs may have merchant affiliates. So you might have a load serving entity, a load serving entity, a load serving entity, and a merchant who has no retail load obligation. So what do you do if you do it based on supply share? Well, the supply share is going to include the merchant. So the big questions are like, what do you do with the merchant supply? Do you set it to 0? And then just allow the load serving entities to have affiliates to have a share? Or do you normalize them to 100? Is there even a defensible way for the CAISO to say, you're a merchant, this affiliate is a merchant, and this affiliate is a load serving entity? Are there ways we could collect information about, their status, commercial status, in order for us to distinguish one for the other? But essentially, there are some affiliates like this in the WEIM, and we would need to figure out what to do with them absent more information. So there's an example on the next slide. If I'll go through that and then I'll pause. So let's say in one of these BAs, the real-time demand forecast is 1,000 megawatts. And you say, okay, there's 3 affiliates in the BA. You're going to categorize 2 of them as load serving entities and 1 as a merchant, however that can be done. And you say, that load serving entity has 80% of the registered supply in that BA. That load serving entity 2 has 15% of the registered supply, and the merchant has 5%, just a small share. Then you could say, okay, well, the load serving entity number 1 gets 800 megawatts, so 80% of the 1,000 megawatt forecast. Load serving 2 gets 150 or 15%, and the merchant gets none, and you just leave their share unallocated. Or you could do like the bottom example does, is you sort of take the merchant share out. If you agree the merchant should get no load serving credit, you take the merchant share out, but then you renormalize the ratios to 100%. So you'll say load serving, LSE1 gets, basically 80 divided by 95% of the forecast and so on. So you don't have any supply unallocated in that case, but, perhaps that is overestimating the load share of that LSE in that context. So these are all workarounds that are, going to be, have a lot, we'll say it generously, have a lot of uncertainties attached to them. But if we want to move forward with a load serving obligation approach in the real-time market, we're not going to be able to avoid having a way to apply it to every participant in the market.
Could we require that entities that want to be treated get credit for a load serving obligation have to provide us the data? Is there a downside to that?
That could be, that could be possible. Say you're in one of these groups, if you could either provide the information if it's available, or we default all of you to 0, basically. If it helps, I don't think it's public information to be sharing how many affiliates are in HBA, but if it helps, this subset as of information today would apply only to 2 WEAM entities. So it's not that may limit some of it's not a widespread issue, but you still have to figure out what to do there.
Wait, so only 2 because there are more than 3 or less than 3 or, in what way does it apply to only 2 of the BAAs?
There are only 2 BAs in the WEIM that have multiple registered affiliates and are not going to be part of the EDAM launch. So basically a way to say is that if this sort of method were approved by the board and FERC and we implemented it, you're going to implement it at a time where it may apply to 2 WEIM entities at that time.
Okay, and the rest are basically just one entity BAs, basically.
One entity BAs, or they're multi affiliate BAs that will be part of EDAM.
Joining EDAM, yeah.
Yeah. Of course, the CAISO is one of those, right? The CAISO is a multi-affiliate BA in EDAM. So these types of things we're thinking about, and we'd love to have some feedback, from the MSC and the stakeholder group about, how these load serving obligation numbers are being calculated.
Can one of these be viewed as more conservative than the others in the sense that you're less likely to pass the test of the second case, for example, because essentially the load is increased?
Well, if I'm reading this right,
No,
option
I'm
one
sorry,
would
I've got that backwards, don't I? Go ahead, Jim.
Oh, option 1 would be the more conservative.
Right, it has lowest
The load numbers are lower.
Obligation.
Yeah, and that's like, I don't know how good of an assumption it is necessarily to say that your supply ratio of the BA is a good proxy for your load. It would seem to be that larger load serving entities who are vertically integrated probably have more supply that they're participating or not participating with in the market, but maybe there are things I'm not sure about that make that a bad assumption.
Well, and if it's an advanced supply share, with renewables and all sorts of resources with different outputs, what's the relationship between those supplies and load? It's so that's the weakness of this approach is, who knows how much relationship how accurate it'll be. It could be significantly inaccurate for one. It's only two BAs at this point, but it might be kind of inaccurate for some of the entities in those 2 BAs.
Mm-hmm.
Because right, you'd be using some sort of historical supply share. You wouldn't be using the supply share, the supply in that interval, right? You'd be using something historical, right? And that
you could, yeah. you'd be taking master file data probably.
Mm-hmm.
All of the PMAX, basically summing up the max capacity of all the registered resources.
Which might not be very accurate if you've got a bunch of wind and solar in there, and what do?
Yeah.
You can see this becoming kind of complicated to do,
Yeah.
which would be the advantage of telling them to give you metered data if they want to be treated.
Well, hopefully this is a good segue into Quinn's presentation. She's going to share more information about how the load serving obligation approach seems to impact the pass or fail rates of BAs under different assumptions. And so we thought it was necessary to share with you, how the CAISO is proposing or is thinking about calculating these values for better context into her presentation.
Okay, thanks. So, James, you're going to go next to scarcity pricing, or are we going to go to Quinn? I think we're going to let you let your momentum carry you into scarcity pricing, if I'm not mistaken.
I can do it either way. I can do this now, or I can wait until we switch topics.
The scarcity pricing presentation is relatively short, so.
Sure, I'll do it now. Okay, so similar to the BA level market power, my intention for this presentation is just to set some context and provide a rough timeline of what the discussions have been looking like. So let's go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to try to summarize the core problem statements that the working group has been talking about since the initiative began. And the core one really is that the CAISO market scarcity pricing is all effective only after shortages of various kinds are happening. And that's not a best practice of scarcity pricing across LMP markets, where you have ways of gradually, where the risk of shortage is gradually incorporated into the market price before the shortage happens, so that you can have market participant response, instead of being reactive to the actual condition, you can be proactive and potentially either resolve the shortage before it happens or maybe even lessen the severity of it. But and we can see that also in the sense that when shortages happen, penalty prices kick in at large prices. And so you can have conditions where you have prices that are moving up and down very rapidly, whether or not there's a shortage. And so these bouncy prices become quite unpredictable. And it's hard to argue that those prices produce good incentives for people to follow the conditions very well, because they're not sure how things are going to resolve themselves. And so having more gradual scarcity pricing and mechanisms to allow the market to do that is really what the working group has been focused mostly on. Second part of that is less so about the mechanism to induce scarcity pricing in a proactive way in the market, but more so about the actual prices themselves. And so the working group has discussed that we have, administrative penalty prices that right now are anchored to and scaled on the market supply bid caps. And potentially that these, notwithstanding that the bid caps themselves are the thing that's anchored to, but also that these prices were conceived a long time ago and perhaps even, just in and of themselves are out of date. And so for those reasons, they may not reflect the quote unquote true value of reliability or scarcity, to achieve proper price formation and give the good incentives during scarce conditions. And also, if the prices are not right, quote unquote, then you may be weakening incentives for entities to offer into the CAISO or the WAM and EDAM in times of scarcity from outside the market. Finally, a big one is that much of the scarcity pricing, as we think of it as it relates to reserve product shortages and other things like that, they don't apply consistently across the market footprint because there are inconsistencies with how reserves are procured across the market footprint, and therefore you can conceive that there may be inconsistencies in outcomes during tight system conditions when, the CAISO BA, for example, procures its AS through the market and could have, in times of AS shortages, price formation impacts that are uniquely applied to the CAISO and not others. And so it was part of the working group really wants a way to apply these problem statements symmetrically across the market footprint to the extent possible, so that you can have a symmetry in outcomes and expectations. Let's go to the next slide.
One thing I want to point out, James, before you go on, is that first bullet, and then actually the third bullet too. We have FlexiRamp. It should produce scarcity that's gradual, but it doesn't work. It isn't that we don't have a product, it's that the product doesn't work.
Right. It's not producing prices that are significant enough to induce any sort of change in behavior from market participants or sufficiently signal emergency conditions in any proper way.
Or even scarcity. I mean, I've looked at this and talked, with some of the CAISO staff about the data in some of these times. And there are times when we have no FlexiRamp at all within the constrained region, but the price is still zero because we're counting stuff that can't be delivered and other things. So it's design features and implementation features that it doesn't work, which we have to have. And I think we have to have in mind for anything else. And until we fix those problems, just having more products with a zero shadow price doesn't solve anything.
So that's the second sub point here in the first bullet, right?
Yeah, so this slide will attempt to sort of summarize the transition between the working group discussions and the actual straw proposal, which is that, in the working group discussions, we basically said at the time that we conceived of three potential paths forward. You're either talking about we'll call it an extended FRP product. So, Scott's right that the existing FRP product, can produce scarcity price signals in some way. The working group thought, and we had presentations from the Department of Market Monitoring, who have argued that the CAISO needs a longer look-ahead reserve product to manage net load uncertainty on a longer time frame. Well, part of what doing that with an associated demand curve is that you can get the scarcity out farther in advance into your current market prices, which is exactly what, the kind of thing that we were doing. But part of the heartburn there is that Scott mentioned there's existing issues with the current FRP. So not just in the price formation, but also ongoing discussions about how storage state of charge and the FRP interact and things like that are unresolved. And so was it premature to start thinking about an extended FRP product when you've got ongoing issues with the current one you're still working with? The second thing is that you can say, okay, well, you could use ancillary services as the method to apply scarcity pricing, but that's obviously a very, very long-term effort because it would first require that the entire WAM agrees to buy AS in the market if you want to have it symmetrically applied, which is the goal, the working group's goal. So that is a huge hurdle. And then you're also going to need to talk about better ways to re-procure AS in the real-time market beyond what's being done today. And so those are very long-term solutions to this problem. That was not one that basically anybody favored. And then the third path is, okay, well, you don't extend FRP, but you can conceive of a new reserve product something brand new that we would conceive of that fits into a longer horizon. And there's, we're just introducing imbalance reserve. It hasn't been implemented yet. We have reserve products that are going in that we don't know yet what their actual real world impact will be yet. And so it seems there's a lot of reserve product fatigue amongst our stakeholder group, which honestly I can't blame them for. So at the time, the CAISO didn't really see a path forward on, a really near-term scarcity pricing design. There was recognition of this possibility for what we'll call an energy supply margin approach, which maybe I can talk a little bit more in the upcoming slides, that the CAISO, at least in the straw proposal, dismissed the idea of that. But then, in the working group meetings that have happened after, the CAISO has sort of reconsidered that as a potential possibility. And basically, those that are aligned with that sort of approach say, well, you can implement forward-looking scarcity pricing in a way that doesn't involve procuring a new reserve product or designing one. And so potentially you could skip some of these problems and go right to comprehensive scarcity pricing in a way you're not even thinking about a new reserve product. And so we can talk a little bit about what that is. But at least in the August straw proposal, the CAISO dismissed that option. So what the proposal did instead is say, okay, well, we'll think about these other things later when other design discussions have happened. Instead, we'll try some more incremental improvements that are really just enhancing the existing emergency-based pricing that we already have. For example, some methods to ensure that when operators are shedding load, that the market's sending out the highest possible scarcity price during those conditions. And a second proposal that's re-looking at the price formation during armed load procedures in the CAISO, and to try to get the RTD to recognize that when it dispatches the capacity that's released when operators arm load, to recognize that dispatching that capacity for energy has a reserve opportunity cost that RTD can't calculate because reserves are not reprocured. They're held fixed in the RTD. And so you could potentially get higher prices in the RTD during armed load to better reflect the severity of the situation in there. So that was where we left off in August. And then the reaction to the August straw proposal was sort of a mixture of some folks being very, very disappointed that the CAISO continues to defer its comprehensive scarcity pricing design, and others that sort of said, well, we like what's the limited version of it in the straw proposal. Let's just move forward with that. And so with that, we'll go to the next slide, where in October, the CAISO, at the WEM governing body meeting, the CAISO and the stakeholders did what's called a spotlight presentation on price formation, with which staff sort of able to provide the governing body with some foundational knowledge of the things going on in price formation. And as part of that, we highlighted to the governing body that we would be reinitiating a working group process on a comprehensive scarcity pricing design based on the disappointment of some stakeholders that the CAISO continues to put this off. As part of that, we had stakeholder presentation from VITA, which sort of advocated for enhanced scarcity pricing in the markets to the governing body to meet some of the objectives from the previous slide. And then the governing body received information letters sort of urging them to move in opposite directions on comprehensive scarcity pricing, which is, WPTF submitted a letter to have the governing body direct the CAISO to be working on a robust scarcity pricing design urgently, where the joint California LSEs sort of are arguing in the opposite direction. So that happened in October, and then that takes us to the next slide, which is a month later in November. We held technically 2 working group sessions, but it was more of, it's the same working group session. It's just that we needed some overflow time. So basically what happened at this session is that the CAISO presented a plan to stakeholders that we would split the scarcity pricing part of the initiative into 2 parallel tracks, where we would continue to make progress on the market power mitigation and the limited scarcity pricing options that we proposed in the August draft proposal, but at the same time initiate these working group discussions, we'll call it track 2, on comprehensive scarcity pricing, with the hope that we could make progress in a way that we can take the conclusion of track 1 and track 2 to the governing body for a decision at the same time. So obviously there was a lot of feedback to that at these working group meetings, which is why we needed 2 extra hours. But as part of that working group meeting, you had the joint LSEs, Edison on behalf of the joint LSEs, and Gridwell on behalf of WPTF present along the same lines of the things that were in their public letters to the governing body in the month prior in October. And just one thing to highlight is that the Gridwell did provide some more information on, their an energy supply margin type framework, which is a way to describe moving forward with scarcity pricing without implementing new reserve products. And so at this working group meeting, the CAISO led some technical discussions on comparing the differences between what a reserve plus a demand curve approach would look like relative to an energy supply margin approach would look like, and ultimately concluded that, if you have you can basically set them up in ways, if the assumptions are the same, in ways where they would really produce very similar outcomes, but it just, of course, differs on how they're implemented, and framed up some major design questions around, whether or not the scarcity pricing should be applied at the nodal level versus the BA level versus the footprint level, and should scarcity pricing apply in a day-ahead market and other things. One notable exemption that we did not talk about during that meeting, which is really the most important question probably, which is how the actual cost functions are derived. Because, really, if you agree that either approach gives you the same outcome, then the thing to start thinking about is, okay, well, what's the outcome we want? Which really results in what cost function does the method assume when you're short of X amount, what's the scarcity price it produces? So in that sense, it sort of did avoid a very key question that will need to continue to be debated. But nonetheless, we did have some more technical discussion than we've had in the past on what this approach would look like. So I think that might be my last slide on scarcity pricing. If you can you preview? Is there a slide 21? Oh, okay. One last. I won't belabor this point because essentially we took written comments from the November sessions and the camps. I don't really think that November sessions changed anybody's mind in terms of the position that they were in prior to the meetings, which is, it happens. But I want to summarize here what I see as sort of 2 different camps and their arguments, both during the meeting and in the written comments, where you have a camp A, which is more focused on pausing the track 2 parts of the initiative, the more comprehensive scarcity pricing, to say basically it's premature to be doing these designs because EDAM and DAME are still being implemented. A lot of staff and stakeholder bandwidth is focused on those things right now. We should ensure we need to keep that bandwidth there to ensure a successful EDAM and DAME launch. And in any case, we don't know what EDAM and DAME, what the real world impact of those market changes are going to be. And so you're piling on these big market design changes on top of a market design that you're not even really sure what the impact of that's going to be. There are some within that camp that make arguments about that scarcity pricing is not needed at all, that the CAISO, the CAISO itself is implementing or introducing 6,000 to 7,000 megawatts of new supply a year. The missing money problem is handled in RA. There's no need to have scarcity pricing to incent new generation to come online because that's all being handled in various outside procedures. Scarcity pricing is a cost to ratepayers that doesn't guarantee additional reliability benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And so because of those thoughts, recommend the CAISO move forward with basically what's already in the August straw proposal and not work on the comprehensive scarcity pricing until CAISO and stakeholders have had enough time to review the market performance of EDAM and DAME. And
So
then you have
James, quickly,
yep.
before you go on, just so how long do you have a sense of how long that would of a delay that would be? Are we talking a year? Or
I think frankly that it will differ. I don't think this camp would agree on the same number probably necessarily. I think there are some that would probably prefer never to think about scarcity pricing.
That's yeah.
And there are probably some that would. Remember, if you can remember in WEIM history that there were year one enhancements and other things that when the market kicked off, it's prudent, obviously prudent to make space for policy needs for quick changes that will inevitably be needed after EDAM goes live, and the policy team at large is making space for that. But the question then becomes, you're right, like how long is long enough to know when it's time to proceed is sort of an open question.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt your momentum there.
That's okay. I'll conclude with some of what I see as sort of the three main points of the other camp, which is that CAISO's lack of a sufficient scarcity pricing design undermines reliability and efficient price formation. And as part of efficient price formation also means efficient incentives for the right types of market behavior during scarce tight system conditions. There's also a feeling like CAISO should not expand BA level market power mitigation, especially to the CAISO BA, without adding scarcity pricing. And there are call outs to previous commitments that the ISO has made in the past to sort of couple these things together. And so there's some view of by proceeding with enhanced market power mitigation, especially applied to the CAISO as was proposed in August, that the CAISO is not fulfilling its commitment to consider them together. And then finally, the energy supply margin approach, as conceived by Gridwell and WPTF in general, did receive some support from this group as a way to, again, think about how to implement scarcity pricing without a new reserve product, with the argument being you avoid a lot of these pitfalls, but you can also maybe, by avoiding these pitfalls, you can actually implement it a lot faster, even if in a whiteboard setting working from scratch, one may prefer or not the reserve shortage pricing method of doing scarcity pricing. If you can implement them in a way that produces similar outcomes, you might as well take the path that gets you there the fastest. So that's my context setting for the scarcity pricing discussion.
Thank you, James. So Jim, Scott, any observations, questions?
Well, I think we're gonna, return to this topic when we do our presentations on it. So I think I'll hold for then.
Right. There's still a lot yet to come. Is there anybody in the? Sorry, Scott. And do you want to add anything?
I think it's best, as Jim said, to just wait.
Okay. Anybody in the audience with a comment or question? I don't see a hand up. So thanks so much, James. That was very thorough, and appreciate your patience with the questions, and surely there'll be some later as well. So I think we're ready for Quinn Zhao to join us with some results of the simulations of the performance of some of the MPM variance. So looking forward to this.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Check. Sounds good. Okay. This is Quinn, Market Performance and Advanced Analytics.
Actually,
in
can you
section
speak
we'll
up a
walk
little
through-
bit or turn something up? You're barely audible.
It's a little low. Yeah.
Hello, is this better?
Oh, much better.
Okay, cool. So in this section, we'll walk through the updated analysis for BA level MPM. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'll try to go really fast, just highlight the key points of each slide. And then if you have any further questions, clarifications, we may follow up offline as well. So this slide summarizes the scope of phase 2, I would say, and how to interpret the results. Compared to the prior review, this phase updates the analysis to, first of all, 2025 summer data, while the overall framework remains the same. We evaluated 8 algorithm variants generated by this full factorial combinations of 3 design factors, each with 2 settings. So that's 8 in total. And these 3 design factors were selected in response to MSC suggestions and stakeholder comments from the previous phase. The 3 factors are listed here. First one, adjusted grouping or the grouping algorithm. So from DMM's comment, there was this one scenario if a lower priced group may pass the test when evaluated alone, but it may not pass the test when merged with the higher priced group. So in theory, we hope the higher price groups who are not export constrained could be helping with extra supply available. But if that doesn't happen, then maybe the lower price group could be better off on its own. So this adjustment adds an extra step to test the next group on its own if the merged group fails. That's the first bullet. The second one, testing KAISO. So this is a debate if KAISO should be part of the test. And the third one is adding LSO component. Jim's have talked about that in his part 2. So at the bottom, there's a table that shows how the 8 variants are constructed. We start with the grouping and grouping adjusted on top. Those are the basis of grouping algorithms, basis of the 8 combinations, and go down, we have LSO component, test KAISO component, and then the last row will be adding both of them together within each grouping or grouping adjusted. Next slide, please.
I don't want you to give
Sure.
away the bottom line entirely, but we were asking James about which of these there might be, agreement among the group ahead of time that there was a preference for one versus the other. Could you go back one slide, Silas? And if I remember what James said, adding the load serving obligation, it seemed to be generally recognized that was a good idea. There was a division of opinion on whether or not to test the California ISO. So whether that makes a difference or not will definitely be of interest. I don't think the adjusting the grouping, let's see, doing the grouping all together was something that was supported, but whether there are one tweak or another that's preferred by the group, I didn't get a sense from James' answer whether there was. So to tell you what James said, if we didn't emphasize the impact of LSO results. I mean, it's interesting to know what they are, but there seems to be consensus of that. On the testing the KAISO, is there sort of a bottom line? It sounds like that does make a pretty significant difference as well in the results. So that'll probably be something to be focused on in the future. And then, if you don't mind hinting a little bit, turn to the last page of the murder mystery. The adjusted grouping algorithm, if that didn't tend to make much of a difference, so it's unlikely that we're going to have to spend a lot of time worrying about that in the future. Are those all fair statements? That it's really the
Yeah, so
one, there's the biggest difference and
on
the
the
biggest
scale
controversy.
level, sorry. Yeah, so on the scale level, you're right. I think your understanding was on the just the right direction. So this adjustment, this is one step added to the current original grouping approach, and then from the result, we see marginal improvements in the, well, marginal increase, I would say, in the pass rate overall. You'll be able to look at the actual numbers in a few slides, and
Right.
that will be like a marginal improvements. And then LSO is pretty significant in terms of the deltas showing up. And then test CAISO, you're right there. And then the combinations will, the combinations will drag the performance into like a middle ground sort of feeling. So again, the numbers will be shown in a few slides.
Okay, so just a summary. The first one's probably not. It's not going to matter so much that we need to spend a lot of time talking about in the future. The second one, there's disagreement and it makes a difference, so that's going to need to. Paying attention, that's very important. And the third one, it makes a difference, but most of the stakeholders are on one side for a priori reasons. So we won't need to talk about that quite so much. Jim and Scott, is that a fair summary? Have I distorted what we've heard thus
Why
far?
don't we wait till we get to the data, then talk about it?
Okay.
I got the sense that, you know, the spirit of this was to sort of show the incremental effects of each of these variations, not necessarily that all 6 of these are like actively considered options.
Okay, Quinn, looking forward to the results.
All right, sounds good. So next slide, please. Here is a quick illustration. We start with this BA mapping that we saw last time. So at a high level, our current approach tests each BAs individually, and the grouping approach evaluates the BAs in subsets. And from a previous discussion, we believe a joint evaluation better reflects the actual market conditions and competitiveness. And the same as the first phase, the second phase analysis remains a counterfactual study. We took FMM LMPM results. The additional design factors were built on top of the current logic in production. So that's the PPS3 RSI test. And we took the master file register ETSR mapping as the reference for connectivity among BAAs. That means if there are non-base ETSRs defined between the 2 BAs, then the 2 BAs are considered as directly connected, which is the term for the grouping approach, the merging of the subsets. And the last one is competitive LMP of the passing group is set by the lowest MEC in the group. Yeah, next slide, please.
I have a question. Have you,
Sure.
what is the implementation time and solution time and workability of this grouping approach? Have you done analysis of whether what effect it has on being able to implement all of this stuff?
That is a tough one. So this is a prototype kind of thing. I'm not running on the real software solution. I'm taking established results and doing counterfactuals, right? So the performance time of this study wouldn't be a real reference for what could happen in production, I would say. And adding these extra layers, especially this is an iterative approach, would definitely add time to the overall performance. I can't tell you how bad it is or how minimum it is at this point. It also depends on how many groups we start with, and then different combinations we may see at any time of the day. So those are the different factors.
Yeah, but if we have a potential of a bunch of groups, then we have to allow for that and what we can do. I'm worried about whether, you know, we're going to get through this design thing and then say, well, we can't actually implement that. So we're going to have to, we've studied options 1, 2, and 3, but we're going to actually do 6. So I think that's one of the concerns I have, and when we're looking at these things is what are we actually going to be able to implement? And okay,
That's definitely there, and there's always a debate between the accuracy or how detailed this design is versus the performance and engineering side of it. Okay, so then this next one is an actual example. The data was taken from August 11th, 2025, hour ending 21. This is a fairly simple example. We have just two groups to start with. Group 1 in pink or red, the original production MEC marginal energy cost was $75 for this group. And then group 2 in green, MEC of $63. Those are the two groups we start with. And in original production result, group 1 failed and group 2 passed. In the original grouping approach, we start with testing group 1, that's a higher MEC group, and then go into test group 1 and 2 because there is a direct connection between the two groups. And the adjustment will be the third step. If step 2 fails, then test group 2 by itself. That is the added layer. If we have more than 2 groups, then we repeat this iteration down to the rest of the list. And go on to the test variations. We start with grouping approach or grouping adjusted approach. The result remained the same. Group 1 failed, group 2 passed. There's no change there. If we add load serving obligation, then we see that both groups pass under either grouping or adjusted grouping approach. Then we add test CAISO onto the groupings. Both groups fail, either original grouping or adjusted grouping. Then the final one is adding LSO and test CAISO onto the grouping approaches. On the original grouping approach, group 1 passes, group 2 fails. Under the adjusted grouping, both groups pass. So in this example, you sort of see the different variations, how different components can change the test result one way or another. Next slide, please. So this is the same slide James showed before. This is to see how actually formulation-wise how load serving obligation changes the formulation. In this counterfactual study for LSO, I'm actually using the metered load at the most granular level available. So those are the default or default load aggregation point, or ELABs, those are EIMs, and then CLABs, those are custom labs. If an entity choose to define a custom lab, then we get data at that level, then we use that data. And adding load serving obligation changes two things in the test. The first thing is withheld capacity. James have talked about it as well. So this is a step where we rank and select the potential pivotal suppliers. And the second impact is on the RSI test itself. We changed that term highlighted in orange. So that is the supply from potential pivotal suppliers. We changed that to a more complex formulation, I would say. I think, Jamie, you had a question about how the non-participating resources contribute into this total summation. You can think of it, well, first of all, it only matters, this LSO term only matters for the potential pivotal suppliers or withheld capacity rate. So if it's a fringe competitive supplier, then LSO is not part of the picture in the formulation. So if an entity fall into the PPS3 list for this interval, and the entity has a load serving obligation, then the supply from this entity would be really from either the participating resources plus the fixed supply from the non-participating resources. And we compare that sum to the load serving obligation. That's how the comparison comes along in the max supply min versus LSO term. And the concept is that if this entity has a lower load serving obligation, well, if this entity's non-participating resources already cover the load serving obligation, then it doesn't matter because the minimum supply level is already there. If the non-participating resources from this entity is lower than its load serving obligation, then we may potentially see the changes in this swapping of minimization and maximization. I hope that clarifies something. Let me know if I made it more confusing or you have any further questions.
So what do you know about the non-participating resources at the moment?
For some entities, larger entities, not to say any names, right? We do see some, well, from the numbers, we see significant changes going 2 slides over.
But I guess
so
if a
it does make sense for,
if a resource is not participating because it's on outage, for example, would you even know that? Or
yes, well, let me clarify my language here. So non-participating resource, this term is a defined term in CAISO design document. It means it's an EIM resource that is not submitting an active bid. And these resources are base scheduled only resources. That means we follow the base schedule in CAISO dispatch. We don't move them. We just place them as they will.
okay, so they're in the base schedule.
That's the fixed, right?
Okay. And so there might be a
That's
third category, which is like a resource that's not in the base schedule, or even submitting EIM bids that might be part of their portfolio too. But I guess they're basically being withheld from the market then, so we don't need to worry about there being supply from them, I suppose.
Right. So if they're not base schedule only resources, we call them non-participating resources, then they're participating because they come with a bid, then they're withholdable and we calculate the ramp max or ramp min accordingly.
Right. I guess I was just pointing out, I think there could be another kind of truly non-participating, which isn't part of anything, but I don't know why they would
If that is the case, then it's not part of the formulation. Any other questions before we move forward? Sounds good. Next slide, please. So we start by looking at this overall pass rate this summer. We had a fairly mild summer this year. Well, last year already. The chart shows the number of BAAs on the y-axis and then grouped into bins of pass rate percentages in x-axis. This is the original result. We're seeing 12 BAAs passed 95% of the time. These bins are 10% bins, and then the last bar is 95% or more. So that's the original production pass rate. Next slide, please.
Sorry, and are we looking at like 15-minute? What's a unit here of what were the intervals of these?
These are RTPD 15-minute. Yep. Next slide, please. Here is the actual table that tells the difference between all the different scenarios and BAAs. So it's a little crowded. We can start with the first column. That's BAA name. They are roughly clustered by geographic regions. So the first set is Pacific Northwest, followed by Central Mountain, followed by Southwest, and then the last 4 are California. We start there. The second column is original pass rate. These are the numbers behind the plot we saw just now. These are the overall pass rate per BAA. If we count closely, we can see whoever fall into the highest bar we just talked about. And that's the second column. After that, those are the, by column names, those are the different variants, the 8 variants we talked about just now, and they come in pairs. So grouping and grouping adjusted are the third and fourth. Go with grouping plus LSO, 2 columns over, grouping plus test KAISO, 2 columns over. The last 2 are the all combinations together, so grouping plus test KAISO plus LSO. And these delta, well, the numbers are delta pass rates under each algorithm. So you can compare the pluses and minuses in the deltas, and those are color-coded. A green means there's an increase in pass rate. A red means there's a decrease in pass rate. And the darker the color means the number is higher in absolute value. We can tell that grouping method generally increase the pass rate, slightly increase the pass rate, I would say, from this year's data. This extra adjustment step, that one step enhancement, I would say, has marginal increase if we compare the different pairs across the different options. And then adding LSO significantly increases in pass rate for some of the entities, especially Pacific Northwest, and that's the green, darker greens we see in the first batch. And adding KAISO part of the test creates a whole lot of red. That means that decrease the pass rate for almost everyone. And you see deeper colors down at the bottom of the table. Those are the BAs when they had close to 100 pass rate. Now we're talking about somewhere 97%, 96, 97%. And if you're looking, yes.
Sorry, Quinn. The CISO original pass rate of 100%, is that sort of using the assumption that they would always pass? Or is that using some, okay, so that's kind of default to 100%.
Right. So we don't test KAISO, it's auto pass and it's 100% passing.
Okay.
If we don't test, a BAA means if it's not import constrained, we consider it as pass as well. That's why we see these high numbers in the pass rate.
It's not just if they're import constrained, right? It's if they're import constrained from the KAISO. So you could have the Pacific Northwest that separate, and everybody in the Pacific Northwest would fail, even though they're not import constrained. They can import from each other, right?
True. So
that's why we have the fail rates for the Pacific Northwest, because they separate into a group, and then without the grouping, they'd always fail. They have to fail once they're separated from the KAISO, right?
It's 2 layers. If we test them and if they fail, then the first layer is if they're separated, right? You're right. If they have higher price, then we test them. If they get tested, they could pass or fail depending on the numbers we receive under current test.
Right. I mean, depending on, but since all these balancing areas basically have 1 or 2 people in them, so if they're tested by themselves, they're always going to fail, right? Mm-hmm. So it becomes so when the Pacific Northwest separates, everybody in the Pacific Northwest necessarily fails because they've only got 1 or 2 entities, so they all fail a 3 pivotal supplier test, and we're testing them separately. But we see here that even when we group them, it doesn't make much difference, right? Because it's still, if we unless load serving entity, they're all still going to fail. And the only thing that matters is then when you go to the over to the next set of columns, that when you take care of the load serving obligations, that matters because a lot of them have big load serving obligations and they can't really withhold. But it's still, so those numbers, some of those numbers get up into the 90s now. So that makes a fair amount of difference in terms of significant reduction in the amount of failures.
Over mitigation.
Much more than the grouping. So you can see,
Yeah, and grouping in KAISO doesn't really have a huge effect on those Northwestern testing CAISO doesn't really change the Northwestern guys a lot. So it is really their own sort of
It
relationship.
goes back to the whole lot of failures. I mean, it goes back to every time they're separated from the CAISO, they still fail because it doesn't matter if the CAISO's competitive or not when they're separate.
But grouping 2 or 3 like self-pivotal guys with each other is still pivotal is basically
right.
James wanted to jump in, it looks like.
Yeah, I just want to point out the grouping approach column doesn't look very impressive, but these are deltas from the original value. So for someone like a Vistra at the top, it's 2.1% absolute delta from 93.4, but it might be more like a 30 or 40% change, 30 to 40% of the time they would have otherwise failed, they now pass in the grouping test, right? Because they're, So
But still,
not
very much, because it's, especially for the ones that are failing 20%, it's not changing that needle much. And we know that they should, because if we look over to the columns where we take account of load serving obligations, well, the truth is they should be passing. So they should be passing, but when we don't take account of the load serving obligations, making the other difference, the other changes doesn't really get us close to the truth. So why bother? If this is a big resource of intensive thing, and maybe, so, unless we're going to be able to accurately account for load serving obligations, it looks to me like why bother with this? And then this is only for 25. I mean, I think, you pointed out that this is the 25 was a mild summer. I was looking back at the presentation before, which had the 24 results, and the CAISO was failing, people were failing all of those hours, all of those evening hours, just like 100%. Now it's only, 3.3 times 8. So that's about 25% of the time. So it'd be interesting to see how this comes out with the load serving obligations on 2024 data.
We haven't done this counterfactual on top of 2024. Yeah, we could do that because some of the comments we received were, can we see the updated data for 2025 with added capacity into the system? Does it make it better? So we figured we'll use the updated data set.
So I agree with you
That's a
on
good
25,
point, yeah.
but I think we also want to look at 24 because it's not just more capacity, it's also a milder year, and look at a winter and see what it does, in a
Right.
winter month.
Was 24 the year that the Northwest was isolated in January? That had the big price peak? Yeah.
Right, January. But the results that the CAISO and Quinn presented in September were for the third quarter of 24, and they always failed.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. It would be interesting to see that.
Noted.
And just to clarify, Scott, when you say you don't see the point in doing any of this without adding the load serving entities, you meant grouping.
The grouping part, because it doesn't, it
doesn't do much. Yeah.
I mean, for some of the BAs that are already passing 97 or 98% of the time, obviously it's almost none. It can't be material because they pass so much. And even for the ones that are failing, it's a pretty small change for most of them.
Well, I guess that maybe puts a bright side on your concerns over computational intensity of these different grouping approaches too. Maybe it doesn't matter much.
Well, but I think, the thing is, it doesn't matter much by itself, but I think in order to make the load serving obligation part matter, you have to group so that you've got the competition from the people that now have, you're not withholding as much supply from the market. Because if we just did the load serving obligation, then there's one load serving entity in each BAA, it'd still fail,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's possible. We haven't looked into that side to add load serving obligation alone without grouping.
This is where it goes back to what we were talking about 10 years ago. We were talking about, the balancing area operators supplying imbalance energy which isn't even in the dispatch. It's for the people that aren't in the balancing area that aren't following their base schedule. And they're having to buy the balancing from the balancing area operator, and the balancing area operator wants to be that market based. Well, here this calculation isn't, I'm not sure this is, it's a little more complicated than even what we're doing. Because even if it was only the load serving entity in the market, if it was selling power at the high price to the entities that are buying balancing services, it still might have market power. So you need to have the grouping so that you've got multiple balancing areas, not just the balancing area operator being the only one that can sell in the market when it's constrained. I guess, yeah, because you can't, if it's constrained, you still want it to fail, even though it's a load serving entity, even though it has a load serving obligation, because there's only one entity in the balancing area. And it's not really that there's no load, because there's still the imbalances. Am I being completely opaque, or is this sort of making sense?
I think these are very good points to consider, along with the complexity and the direction we're going forward with. Something we'll need to take back and think about and talk about more.
Good, and I need to think about it too, but I'll talk less and think more. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the discussion. And I guess we are good on this page.
Well, just
Next
wait,
page,
let's
please.
look a little more over at the far right, where you see that their grouping with the CAISO doesn't make much difference as long as we have the load serving obligation. So that's still a slight, but and there is a slight reduction in passing for the CAISO. But if we do add the CAISO in and don't group, even in this mild summer, we're getting a drop in the pass rate for the CAISO, which we know isn't the truth, because the truth is further to the left, further to the right, where we take account of load serving obligations. So just doing the CAISO moves us away from truth, unless we got to take account of the load serving obligations.
Yeah, the last two columns are definitely interesting. So we see a combination of green and red showing up. Pacific Northwest and some Central Mountain entities are all getting the increase, because adding testing CAISO component does not decrease the rate that much.
Yep.
And the rest of them get a little bit of decrease, 0.08. Overall, it's not a huge decrease either.
And can I ask?
Very good to see what that is in 24 and in other periods.
Right. So with the test CAISO without load serving entities, the red columns, the results for CAISO, then that is taking away the PG&E, SCE, or I don't even know if they have the net by status now, but they sort of have this kind of exemption from LMPM based upon a sort of more blunt evaluation of their net position. What's being done in that for those columns? I guess I'm a little surprised that it only goes up by 3%, unless those guys
So
just
if we
aren't the pivotal guys anymore.
Yeah, sorry about that. Right. If an entity is a net buyer, today we don't consider it in the PPS3 withheld capacity evaluation, and that still is true in the counterfactual analysis.
Oh, okay.
So we exempt them from the net buyers out. We look at net sellers, and this is a grouping approach. Withheld capacity is the same, and it really depends on what kind of group CAISO is part of. And the rest of the evaluation follows.
Okay, so the net buyers are still being excluded, or at least
Correct.
they're not being tested, I guess, their supplies being included, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the supplies will be ramping up to the top.
But is that
fringe competitive supplier?
In the LSO scenarios, though, are you switching that to like the same methodology that would be applied elsewhere? where the load serving obligation is being explicitly quantified instead of this kind of net buyer blunt test? Or are they still
Right.
just
So yeah, when I added load serving obligation, that's one step after the exclusion. So the long-term net buyers are first excluded from the withheld, the PPS3 list. And I go into adding the LSO within the withheld capacity formulation. If a load serving obligation exceed their supply, then that makes them a net buyer for that time interval.
Yeah.
Then those are excluded as well. Then I take a look at the rest of the entities that have a positive, an extra supply headroom, I would say, and then rank them.
Right.
That's how it works.
Okay, I wanted to clarify, but James had his hand up. Go ahead, James.
I think it's an open question whether or not the existing long-term net buyer, net seller process survives the new LSO approach, because in some ways the existing process is trying to do a similar thing, just much more poorly.
Yeah.
And
I just assumed it would go away, actually, but
yeah. So the August draw proposal considers them together, but I'll preview with you that we're sort of openly considering whether that continues to be needed.
Okay.
Because the existing process is cumbersome, right? Like why have business processes around something that just doesn't make much of a difference?
Yeah, or I guess you could imagine a long-term net buyer that still has intervals where it's net selling because of just a mismatch between its purchases and its load.
Or vice versa.
Yeah.
Yep.
Although, yeah, but I mean, there are some differences in incentives. I mean, if it's a long-term net buyer, it doesn't have any incentive to drive up the day-ahead market price because it's generally going to be a buyer, not a seller. Right. So if it's sold power in the day, its incentives in the day-ahead market would be different. On anything about saying you're going to withhold supply in real time, even though you've covered yourself in the day-ahead market, isn't going to apply to someone's long-term seller, a long-term buyer.
I guess I was thinking more in terms of like being a midday net seller because you got a lot of solar versus a nighttime net seller or vice versa, something like that, but not the day ahead real-time dynamic.
I think the thing is that you did use the current method for these calculations. So you see that there's a minus 3.1 for, APS, Nevada, CAISO, everybody. It's all the same, and it's all the same 0.8 for everybody. So what's going on is the CAISO is failing 2.3% of the time extra because of when it gets in this, when we don't take account of the load serving obligations, it's failing because of assumed withholding by other load serving entities that are in that grouping when they don't. So it's a completely fake failing. And in this instance, it's only a few percent. Another, would be interesting to see if it's bigger than that in 24, but it looks, like a bad thing to do. How important it is to take account of load serving obligations.
Sounds good.
Yeah. I think the high level takeaway here is that, our instinct that load serving obligations are going to be really important seems definitely to be borne out here.
Agree. Just checking, are we good on this page?
Yeah.
Sounds good. Next page, please. I guess we're tight on time. I'll try to fly through some of the results. This is the variations based on the original grouping approach. The top left corner is the new pass rate under grouping. The top right, going from left to right, we add load serving obligation. So the upper right is grouping with load serving obligation. From top to down, we add KISO tested. So the left bottom is grouping with KISO tested, and then the last one is grouping with KISO tested and LSO. These are charts followed by the real numbers. Next slide, please. And these are the results, variations based on adjusted grouping approach. The top left is grouping adjustment. We basically added the second bin to the first bin and make it 15 BAAs in the top bin. And then the left, right, the bottom right is grouping adjusted plus KISO tested plus LSO. And that shape looks like the same as the grouping adjusted with LSO without KISO tested. The real numbers are, of course, different. Next slide, please. Okay, here are a set of heat maps, sorry. Heat maps, we start with original pass rate from 2025 summer production. The y-axis is the list of BAAs, the x-axis is hours of the day. We color-coded the pass rate, so start with white is 100% in white, down to 75% in blue, down to 50% in yellow, down to 25% in pink, and then 0% in red. We don't have really red color on this chart, which is a good sign. We see really relatively lower pass rate down to the yellowish region. Those are lower pass rate mainly concentrated in midday hours where the BAAs are import constrained, and that's when we test them, right? And when we test them, that's when we saw the failures. Next slide, please.
I want to make a point here that, you know, like it'd be interesting to do some analysis in these yellows in the middle of the day when they're import constrained because there's really, really cheap solar. Is there really evidence that anybody's exercising market power in the Pacific Northwest in those hours when there's all this, you know, cheap power coming in, and that creates market power? It looks, you know.
That will be something interesting to look into. Yep. And yeah, this is the next variation, I assume, under. Oh, right. It was original pass rate. This is under grouping approach pass rate. So under a grouping approach, we saw some increases, slight increases mostly in pass rate, primarily in these early morning to midday hours for Pacific Northwest and then the Central Mountain regions. Next slide, please. This is grouping adjusted. So add that one extra step on top of grouping, we see some further increases in some of the intervals. These are mostly marginal improvements though. Next slide, please. Here is the look. We add load serving obligation component on top of grouping approach. We see the yellows are gone and pass rates increased for almost all BAAs. And the most significant color change is the midday hours for Pacific Northwest again. Next slide, please. Under adjusted grouping approach, adding LSO component further increased the overall passing rate. And next slide. Here is grouping approach with KISO tested. So we saw some of the increases from grouping approach previously, and that remained for the midday hours, and then pass rate dropped for all BAs in hours ending 19 through 21. Next slide, please. Same story under adjusted grouping approach with KISO tested. It largely remained the same as the previous variation. So that extra step doesn't make a difference. Next slide, please. Under grouping approach with KISO tested and add LSO component, this is the look. we got rid of the yellows in the midday hours for Pacific Northwest. And then we still see some lower pass rate, hours ending 19 through 21 for almost everyone. Well, everyone outside of the increased range, increased BAA. Next slide, please. And this is the last variation under adjusted grouping approach with KAISO tested and adding LSO component. We see some further increases in the overall pass rate. Next slide, please. So those are the heat maps. After reviewing the hours of the day, here is another set of additional information, I would call them. To start with, this is a box plot that shows the number of groups formed over time through the study period. So the y-axis is the number of MEC groups, and then the x-axis is the hours of the day. These box plots are mostly the body of that falls within 1 to 3, so that means all BA MECs most of the time fall into 1 to 3 groups in this 2025 summer months. Next slide, please. Here is the frequency of affiliation showing up in WEIM PPS3. So I'll explain. So in the grouping approach, the last step, because I'm using the master file register ETSR mapping, everyone is connected. So the last step of the grouping approach in the study will be testing WEIM as a whole. And in that test, I'm pulling out the PPS3s per interval and map them into this histogram. So this is a frequency mapping for the entities that shows up in the PPS3 list over the WEIM footprint. And the affiliation names are anonymized, so I'm numbering them 1 through 9. This is an exhaustive list. We have probably over 100, 200 affiliations registered, and this exhaustive list within WEIM gave us 9 out of that list. And as we can see, it's pretty concentrated in top 3. The top 1 has over 30%, the top 2 over 30%, the third one is 20-something%, and the rest are 5-6% or below. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Is it just me? I'm not seeing the next page.
Hi, Silas. We're ready to go to the next slide. Let's see.
Can we do it? I see a little arrow on the screen.
Right. Let me try that.
But you hear me, right?
We can hear you.
I just clicked on the right arrow. It
didn't do anything.
Turns to the next page for me. Do you see the next page, page 21?
Nope, it's stuck on 20 for me too.
Let's see.
Lost Silas.
Well, I guess I can tell you what page 21 shows. It will be the list from, it's a similar list generated from grouping with KAISO tested with LSO component. So this frequency list expands from 9 to 13 affiliations, and the ranking of the entities is reordered. So you will be able to see the shuffling of the entities and a longer list. And do we have Silas back?
I'm back. Like, hi, yes.
Hi, yes, we are on page 21, if you can help.
All right, and then.
Okay, and then next page, please. There we go. This is almost the end. So as I said, the last test in a counterfactual study is testing everyone. And if testing WIM, this final test fails, then we may ended up having some BAs without a competitive LMP assignment under the grouping approach. And here is the statistic. So under adjusted grouping with KISO tested and with LSO, that's the last variation of the 8. Here it shows the percentage intervals having any BA without the CLMP. It's again hours ending 19 through 21, and the percentage of intervals is up to 8.99 in hour ending 20.
This is a situation where we're finding the constrained down grouping to be non-competitive, right? And that's when we have no competitive
Right.
LMP.
So we go through the last test. The last test fails. We can't find any another group or subset to test on or to help the rest of the system. So that is it. And some BAs fail in this last test, cannot get a competitive LMP. Then the question is, do we use their DAB or do something else that's creative? Yes, James, I saw you hand.
Yeah, another way to say it is that there's a group that fails and then never joins with a passing group, such that there's never, remember the competitive LMP is, or well, in this case, technically it's a competitive MEC. The competitive marginal energy cost is never determined because they never form or become part of a passing group when you go through the list.
But it's when it's got to be the constrained down group, because it's got to be, competitive LMP is from the constrained down region. So it's saying the constrained down region fails.
Yep.
I was wondering, back to the earlier discussion, if an impact test would help with this.
It could possibly.
It depends what the situation is, but.
And it depends how you define the impact, I guess. But it seems like if this is really the constrained down region, then their bids aren't really inflating prices. Or I guess they might inflate them locally, but.
I mean, you could say that, well, hopefully that we'd set the DEBs so that even though the constrained down region fails, it would still not have any impact. But
yeah,
that's the issue of, will that be the case if we're talking about storage resources and
you still need DEBs. Yeah.
You can have a storage resource in an area that's a generation pocket sometime of the day and not a generation pocket other times of the day, and they're storing energy when it's a generation pocket and selling it later when prices are higher. And will we get it right? In terms of.
I want to. Sorry, Scott.
Go ahead.
I wanted to point out, just in case it was lost on anybody, that Quinn's referring to this adjusted grouping approach, and essentially what that's doing relative to the approach from the straw proposal is that it's giving the constrained down areas essentially two different ways to pass, because the concern originally was that, and mostly highlighted by DMM, that if you could have constrained down BAs when they're grouped with uncompetitive, high-priced BAs, can sort of act as a poison pill in a way where you appear uncompetitive because you're grouped with somebody who's super uncompetitive. But so the adjusted grouping approach, what it does is it allows you to pass if either you pass as a group or you can pass within your own your own group. And so it should that step should reduce, but it clearly doesn't eliminate the grouping approach from failing the constrained down regions.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for the comments and additional information. Next slide, please. This should be my last slide. So this is something we've seen before. We measured the delta, how far the original MEC is from a competitive LMP generated from the grouping approach. Here, x-axis is 1 through 24 hours, y-axis is percentage of the price delta buckets at that hour of the day. Then we have different colors coded down below. It's indicating the different price delta buckets at the no CLMP group is the light gray, and you can see the other buckets down there. Under adjusted grouping with KAISO tested and adding LSO, that's the last variation. These price buckets for MEC to competitive LMP deltas for failed test primarily fall between $0 to $20. That's how far you're expected to be mitigated under these situations. Okay.
Let me make sure I got that right. So
Sure.
we're not saying that when they failed the test, the unconstrained price is between 0 and 20. We're just saying the impact of mitigation is between 0 and 20.
So if they fail the test, we will mitigate the cost component.
Right. But I'm trying to understand, did you actually rerun?
Yeah.
Did you rerun the case with mitigation for all these scenarios, or did you just do the pivotal supplier test? Because this implies that you reran the solution with lower prices for all of these hours. And I wondered if that's what you actually did for all 7.
No, I didn't rerun everything.
Right.
From the grouping approach, we generate a competitive LMP from the algorithm itself.
Right, but that's the price.
Then I'll be able to, yeah.
That's the price that actually happened. That's not a price delta. So this just says, I think it says that most of the time when they fail, the price is really low. So you're asking, what the blank are we doing?
This delta is taking from the original MEC of a BAA, if it fails, to the competitive LMP assigned to it, and see how much difference we're looking at.
So it's the amount of congestion. It's the amount of congestion between the. Because you didn't rerun the model, so you didn't
name it congestion, but yeah, this is the delta that mitigation will create from the original MEC to the competitive LMP.
No.
Right?
Mitigation might not have any impact. This is just if I understand, this is the difference between the price in the constrained down area and the constrained area. And that might not change at all with mitigation. It would change with building enough transmission to eliminate the congestion, but James, you understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I mean, so an example might be in the production data, if the MEC of a BAA is $50 and then the running it through the grouping approach would have resulted in a competitive MEC of $45, this is showing the $5 difference of its original production MEC value compared to the competitive LMP calculated for it from the grouping approach.
Right, so that's a congestion impact. That's the amount of congestion between it and the constrained down region.
Mm-hmm.
You're not resetting anything to DEBs for this.
That's the point. It's not like the impact of mitigation.
Yeah. No, it isn't, because the DEB may certainly be higher than the you get what I'm saying.
Right. Okay. So I think we're good, and this is my last slide. Any final questions? Hearing none, I guess
Thank
we
you.
all
A lot of
get
great
some
information.
extra points too.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the discussion, and we got something to think about.
We've only got 15 minutes.
That's what I was just asking. in the
Yeah.
chat.
What do you want to do? I mean, this is 20 slides or so forth. Maybe we should just skip to Jim's price.
Oh, I
formation.
don't know. I think this is an important set of topics too. So I don't know. Maybe just try to do them
Well,
quick.
We can, I think we have two options. Keep in mind that the slides are posted publicly.
Right.
We can either highlight what you would like to highlight in the slides on the public call today, and I believe the WebEx will stay open until 4:30. So if we have a little extra time, we can use that. Or we could schedule an alternative public discussion of the slides. Either way, they are publicly posted.
So we
Yeah.
can go to 4:30. We don't have 14 minutes. We have 44 minutes. Is that right? Because I know there's these sunset rules.
correct.
So we can't talk if we're not.
So maybe we'll.
We do have
Try
until
that.
4:30.
Okay.
Okay. Well, why don't I start and see if I can get through
15 minutes apiece.
and try to go
highlights,
fast.
and hopefully there'll be some public questions, but there might
I
not
don't-
be.
Hopefully mine won't take 15, but yeah.
Okay, can
If you're a
Silas, can
professor,
you
we know what happens.
go a couple slides? Skip 2 slides. Okay, next one. Okay, this is just a simple point I wanted to make that, there's some sloppy language at places in the CAISO documents. Here's one that the counterfactual analysis shows the CAISO isn't competitive, and it doesn't show that. All it shows is that 3 pivotal supplier test applied in a particular way yields that conclusion. It doesn't mean that it's actually non-competitive. Testing it's non-competitive has to look at the outcomes in the market. I'm not going to, given the shortest time, I'm not going to beat on that. Go to the next slide. Silas.
Sorry, Scott. I wanted to beat on it because I feel
Okay.
like this has happened outside of just CAISO that, we've fallen into this like defining a market structure measure. And, in California, it's one thing and elsewhere it's others. Defining that as the evidence of market power, where it's the evidence of the potential for market power. As sort of decided by, various processes. And as you're going to get to, the link between this one particular, measure of potential and the actual evidence of it is still kind of, not well documented. And I think is a really important thing we should be looking at in the context of this. Sorry, that's my editorial.
Right, and as we're going to say later, as the other see back said 10 years ago, it's not even just like it's a good measure of market power, of the potential. It's an
Yeah.
extremely conservative measure. So there's, not a lot of potential necessarily for anything to happen. Okay, now go.
And if I can ask you guys, is there any evidence of a relationship to market power? I mean, people
Well,
looked at this empirically.
I mean, that's what, so we were asking, one way of trying to do this would be to look at the competitive benchmark measures and see how they correlate to, say, 1, 2, or 3 system-wide pivotal suppliers. Scott's going to get into why that may not be persuasive, but it's certainly, a good place to start. And yeah, there are, do I know of academic studies? I've been trying to get some people interested. I have maybe, looking at Texas. The trick is you need to find a place that's not mitigating, because what you're looking for is evidence of market power, when one of these conditions, holds, when there's not mitigation already happening. And so you could do it for system-wide in California, but then you still got to sort of filter out what's happening at the local level. You're on mute, Scott.
I don't know why I did that. Yeah, I think as you were saying, Jim, if we do the counterfactuals, it isn't just that we can find, a failure and we have to have some failure that results in an increase in price, and we believe the DEBs, that it's a day and an hour in which I think the DEBs are pretty reasonable, and we've got market power. And the idea that just showing that, on some days where there's, go to the next slide, Silas. If there's a market power problem, we should see it in the data, not just on days where there are really extreme gas prices or something else, which our DEBs are bad, or not just when we're dependent on storage resources and they're the ones we don't estimate the right price for them. We should see it on days where it's pretty clear that we got the DEBs right. And if you see it then that's an evidence of market power. If we don't really have, if it's only in these unusual situations, particularly as I look back at the analysis in 2019, where I looked at the counterfactuals on 2018, and all the hours with the big differences were hours with a really tight gas market, with really high gas prices. Well, that suggestion that maybe that we're not finding market power. You've got problems with your gas price measure in some days. You know, you should see it on normal conditions and not just when you got mismeasured gas prices, if you've really got market power. Silas, go to the next slide. And this is particularly given the approach we use, because the counterfactual simulations that have been done in California are using the lower of the actual bid and the DEB. So if half the time the DEB is wrong, well, when the DEB is too high, you're going to use the actual bid, and when the DEB is too low, you're going to use the DEB. So you're going to end up with finding a market power just because of the mismeasurement of gas prices. So that's why you want to look at, okay, how about the days where we don't have a problem with gas prices? Do we see evidence of market power? Another page, Silas. Another issue in I know it makes it more complicated for the counterfactuals, but if you've got local market power mitigation going on, you need to take account of that in the system market power simulations, because if you don't mitigate for local market power, that would affect prices, even in the broader area. So you're basically potentially mistaking the effect of taking away local market power for the effect of system market power being exercised, because we may definitely get it right in terms of local market power.
But Scott, for the narrow question of testing, do we have a problem with system market power, given that we're going to continue local market power mitigation? It seems like it's still looking at whether the conditions when we would fail the system-wide test and looking at markups. I agree that, one reason why markups might not look that bad is because we're already mitigating them through local.
Right.
But I think that's important information, relevant still, because it's kind of saying system isn't, maybe it's an explanation as to why system isn't as much of a problem. But
Jim, I'm making a different point. I'm saying I think in the test for system market power and running the counterfactual, local market power mitigation may not be applied. So you're using bids that aren't the actual bids, it's the unmitigated bid, when in fact it would have been mitigated. And I don't know all the simulations. The practice may change in different simulations, but if the simulation is not using the mitigated local market power offer, then it's biased towards finding a system market power.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
We go ahead, Silas. Another complication is when we get into the mitigation of batteries and other pondage resources. If we find that there's lower prices in some hours, we really need to look at that over the whole day and run the simulation over the day, and not get a result of, well, we lowered it in some hours of the day by creating higher prices in other hours of the day by depleting the resource. So you have to be careful about that when you're just doing things in real time and not tracking state of charge over the day. And I think that's a reality, that as we get more of an energy limited system, it's going to be more complicated to take account of that. Go ahead, Silas, to the next page. I'll skip over this. I talked about it a little bit, that day ahead market schedules don't necessarily restrain the exercise of market power by big net sellers, but they will by buyers. They have no interest in raising the price in other days. Go ahead for the next slide. I think this speaks for itself, given we're short of time. Let's go on. Go to the next slide, Silas. This is what I was talking about a little bit today, about whether we really need to be applying this test to constrained down regions, and whether that's a good source of resources and added complexity. And I don't know that we got any evidence that there's a problem with the exercise of market power in the constrained down regions. It goes to the point about the lack of any competitive LMP, because we're causing the constrained down regions to fail. And I think we ought to look at whether there's any evidence that there's market power there. that we need to worry about, or we're just going to be creating more problems for ourselves by mitigating where there's no real issue. Go to the next slide, conduct and impact test. And this is a disclaimer. I'm not going into this to say we ought to switch to a conduct and impact test, especially anything near term. But I think we ought to have an accurate understanding of how a conduct and impact test works, and also some potential long-run advantages as the world changes. So that's the focus of a couple of comments here. Go to the next slide. The CAISO stated that the existing LMP framework considers impact because just the competitive LMP framework. And that's just a misunderstanding of how the conduct and impact test works, because the competitive LMP just puts a floor under the price to which the offer prices are mitigated. They can't be mitigated lower than either the competitive LMP or the default energy bid, but they're still going to be lowered within the constrained up region. On a conduct and impact test, if dispatching you based on the default energy bid in the test had no impact on the clearing price, or only a tiny impact, you wouldn't be mitigated. So I'm not going to go through the example on the next couple of pages because it take time, but Silas, go to the next page and the next page. Just walk through a little example here of if you had a battery that had a DEB that was low, even with the competitive LMP, it would still get lowered to the competitive LMP, which would be lower than the price in the constrained region, and it could get dispatched and depleted, even though it had no impact on the clearing price. So there's a different outcome. The conduct and impact test tests whether mitigating the offer price has an impact on the clearing price. And it can be a 10%, conduct test. It can be 5%. You can set whatever impact test you want. But the issue is it tests whether it matters, which is sometimes good for the little entities in the market, the little entities with a very funky cost curve that you maybe get wrong a lot of the time, that if they don't matter, if they're not going to change the price, you don't mitigate them. Now you could say, well, maybe there's still a production cost savings, maybe it's more efficient, but if it doesn't impact the price, why are we second guessing their judgment? Because they probably know their cost function. If they don't have any ability to raise the market clearing price, why mitigate them? Their assessment of their costs is probably more accurate. Go to the next slide. Another impact that benefit of this test is that it accurately measures the cost of fringe suppliers and takes account of it. So it's actually more restrictive than a free pivotal supplier test, because if you've got a whole bunch of high cost supply with a pivotal supplier test, you could pass because we got lots of supply, even though it's ineffective because it's very high cost, and the fringe doesn't matter. In a pivotal supplier test, you'd catch that. They would fail because high cost supply would not constrain and keep the price down from other people raising it. So the conduct and impact test is more accurate. And, there was this discussion about whether, maybe we should keep the mitigation of the fourth and fifth supplier because maybe they're high cost. But if we really think that's a problem, that'd be more reason to go to a conduct and impact test and fix the whole thing, fix the under mitigation, and not have to worry about the potential over mitigation. Go to the next slide. This is just talking about, these points I'm making are not new. We talked about this, these issues about the pivotal supplier test being very conservative back in our paper in 2013. And I've just got a couple of quotes talking about this, about how it's very conservative because of the fact that it can be, that this is taking away all the output of the top three suppliers is an extremely stringent test. If it were really accurate, I think as we said back then, maybe a 1.5 supplier test would be accurate. So when we're going and making these comments that we started about, that failing the three pivotal supplier test says there's a competitive problem. No, it doesn't even mean that there's any lack of competition or any potential for the exercise of market power. It's an extremely, extremely conservative test, in part because it's bad. And that's to go to the next slide. And that's what we talked about in 2013, that because it doesn't take account of the offer price is the fringe and whether it's a high cost fringe. It also doesn't take account of whether the fringe the low cost supply is constrained down in a generation pocket, and it can't apply multiple steps. So that's why it has to be a very conservative test, or at least it's a rationale for having a very conservative test. But it also means it's not a very good test. Go ahead to the next slide, Silas. This is, there's a lot of this talk over the years about somehow a conduct and impact test always has a looser standard. You can set your thresholds however you want. And this is an old presentation I gave some years ago in 2018, talking about actual NISO load pocket tests. And some of the thresholds, in looking at like June 2018, a month or so before this presentation, some of the thresholds were less than 10%. A lot of them were between 10 and 12 or 13%. You can set a different formula than the NISO uses. It's whatever you want. The idea is using an impact test, and we have a 10% margin built into the current 3 pivotal supplier test because the DEBs are 10% are increased by 10%. So you could use a 10% impact test for the conduct and impact test if that's what you wanted to do. So that's not really a reason for choosing one test or the other. Go to the next slide. The other point is, the next couple slides are going the other direction and pointing out it's not perfect. The conduct and impact test doesn't solve all problems of the 3 pivotal supplier test. It can result in false mitigation. If you've got a small supplier in a pocket with a bunch of people that really have market power and exercise and submit high bids, everybody's going to get mitigated. We can't run it testing everybody individual, and it would be unworkable to try that. There's other things that we haven't talked about. There are also issues in software solution times, implementation. It's more complicated to implement because you got to run an unmitigated case. What is the price? Then you've got to run a mitigated case and say, is that within the conduct and impact threshold? And then you might have one region in which it fails and one region in which it passes. So you got to run a third case in which you apply the mitigation. So it has solution time consequences that are different from the 3 pivotal supplier test. So, it may be, something that's unworkable from a solution. You got to think about the solution time impact. So there are pluses and minuses. I'm just trying to get clear that, some of the things that are talked about are not accurate. Go to slide 22.
Scott, I wasn't quite sure the right time to ask this, but in my mind on conduct and impact, so it seems like there's 2 flavors of conduct definitions, and I'm not sure sort of what the state of the art is these days. One would be there's a DEB that's calculated in the way California does, through lots of different kind of indices and assumptions or measures of heat rates and things like that, and then you apply your conduct relative to this sort of ISO derived kind of DEB. And then the other were these, metrics where you kind of use bids during what was some presumed competitive periods, off peak or whatever, to sort of set the DEB for later. And I always thought of that sort of approach as kind of narrowing the band or the degree to which an entity could sort of change the bid from one period to the next. And so it's more of a self-referential conduct kind of measure rather than one against a sort of externally estimated DEB. Is that second approach still used? And I always wonder about the dynamics of that.
It's used for different types of entities. Some I think Ontario has found that works a lot better for their Cascade Hydro and so forth in terms of how they think it works. So they're both used for estimating a DEB. And it just that some jurisdictions find for some resources, they feel it gets a better outcome given, and it tends to be for energy limited resources that have got consistent prices over a long period of time. And reasonable people can disagree about whether there's a better way to set the DEB, and you don't have to set the DEB that way. It's just some people feel that that's reasonable for some suppliers, but if you don't think it's reasonable, you can calculate it a different way. The conduct test, it doesn't matter how, there's no set of rules that comes with it. You can use whatever rule. We can use the same way of calculating the DEBs that we do today in California.
So jargon-wise, conduct is just exceeding a DEB by a certain percentage.
Right.
User specified, and the DEB itself is kind of another dimension that's separate.
Right. And just like setting the threshold is separate. You can choose to set a 10% threshold to 5% or set it, in terms of the frequency of constraint or whatever makes you comfortable. So that, that part is a choice variable. There is one thing that I've been thinking about, and in part because of what Ontario is doing, and we don't know yet how it's going to work out. But if you apply a conduct and impact test in a tool that looks out over the net load peak hours, it's going to take account of, it isn't just going to look at the impact in 1 hour, it's going to be optimizing over the 10 hours. And it's going to say, well, I'm not going to dispatch that at noon, or even if it has a zero DEB, because I know that if I dispatch it at noon, I won't have it at 8 p.m. and I need it at 8 p.m. So that it takes care of some of the problems with faulty DEBs, because you're doing that optimization over the period. Now, we don't have the ability to solve that fast in California. We don't know how ERIC's going to work out in Ontario, but I think it's an interesting concept and experiment about that being a way to get around some of the problems we struggle with energy limited resources. That how are we realistically look ourselves in the eye and say, do we really think we're going to be able to estimate those opportunity costs on the day and set them in advance? Or if we have a tool that basically is solving out over that period, it's solving the opportunity cost and doing all that just as part of the optimization and taking care of it. The conduct test will find no impact, even if our default energy bids are way off. So it's, I think there's something for us to think about as the world evolves, and we don't know exactly how WEC's can evolve, but everything, policies are always changing, but it kind of looks like we're moving towards a more energy limited system, both in the CAISO and the Western EIM and the WEC. And that means that it's going to be more important to get these opportunity cost DEBs right. Okay, so I went on and didn't give people many people on the phone on the web a chance to ask questions. So I'll pause here for a few minutes, then turn it over to you, Jim, for some price formation.
We do have a hand up
from raising their hand.
Yeah, we have a hand up from Adam Swadley.
Hi, Adam.
Hi, Scott. It's Adam Swadley from DMM. I had a question here. So your presentation mentions introducing what I might view as a higher burden of proof of market power before subjecting a BAA to NPM, and also suggests maybe moving in the long term in the direction of a conduct and impact approach. So I guess I wanted to maybe try to link this back to some of the discussion we're having earlier today about the ISO's proposed enhancements to the BAA market power mitigation. So the question then, do any of the ISO's proposed changes, in your view, sufficiently enhance the current BAA market power mitigation approach to the point that, it would impact the urgency of your recommendation to shift toward conduct and impact? And do any of these changes, in your view, make the proposed BAA NPM approach more suitable for including the CAISO balancing area? And then I guess I would have sort of a similar question about the DEBs. There's been recent and ongoing policy work to improve DEBs for both storage and gas resources. I'd view the DEB accuracy issue as independent from the choice of a mitigation approach, but do the potential improvements to DEB changes impact the urgency of any recommendation you might have to move toward a conduct and impact approach in the long term?
You just coupled the two words, urgency and long term. So I was trying to say, I don't think it's urgent. I think it's a long term, and we can wait and see how things play out. But I see a potential for, if we get into a more energy limited system, I question whether we're ever going to, get the storage DEBs very right. Maybe. I'm skeptical of that. I think it's going to have to be some kind of long-term solution. But I'm not saying that we ought to do that. And actually, I also pointed out, there's some limitations of the conduct and impact test. And one is, solution time. That's a big issue. And, it might be that we'd run a conduct and impact test stuck for our energy limited resources, but continue to do it in RTD for other resources. Because we wouldn't have time to go through all this stuff in RTD, even in the forward intervals. And no one who uses conduct and impact does it applies it in RTD. So I'm not, I tried in that slide to make it clear. I'm not saying do conduct and impact. I'm definitely not saying do it soon. I was just trying to correct some of the statements so people can have an accurate understanding of what the choices are. Oh, have I walked away from it enough?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the additional clarity. I think that did come through in your slide. I guess I was more trying to understand how the ISO's current proposals fit in the context of any proposed future changes. If it's that you don't think they're going far enough, or if it's really about concerns about the dev. I heard your concerns about the storage dev. Maybe what was sort of driving your continued recommendation to explore alternative approaches in the future?
Yeah, that's the main thing I'm thinking about. The other thing is we do have the issues about high cost suppliers. The pivotal supplier test doesn't catch that. If we're worried about that, then that's something to think about. Also, if we get more and more constrained down resources so that the pivotal supplier test just doesn't work, then we maybe need to think about it, and so those are the long run sort of questions I'm putting out there, and they're not really long run. They're things we talked about 10 years ago, but they weren't that important 10 years ago, but maybe they're going to be more important. So, there are things to think about and to have a good understanding of what columns A and B are.
Yeah, I think the fact that we don't have a good handle on storage debs, and I agree, I'm not optimistic about ever having a good handle on it, kind of, I think, raises the import of asking these questions. And I guess to the extent that, the proposals that are being looked at here, in a sense, in some dimensions, increase the potential for mitigation, at least within the CAISO, because you'd be adding this new system level screen on top of what was there before, at least under some versions of it. For the rest of the EIM, I think it's definitely a step in a mitigate less often direction, because it would be, if we do, move in the direction of adding a load serving obligation version of that. But then again, for the EDAM entities, there'd be a whole other arena in which they might be mitigated. So I think the issues exist whether we were doing those proposals or not. But I think the overlying, point is that because of the onset of storage and a few other things that we covered at a past meeting, the cost of false positives has just gotten higher than it once was, and we have to really kind of think about exactly how concerned we are about different types of potential market power conditions, because the cost of mitigating is, I believe, increased.
Yeah, and I think the load serving obligation corrects for a lot of the problems we could see from some of the other changes, but I'm worried we're not going to be able to do it, and that we're going to get some change and it's not going to happen. And these results were based on good load serving data.
Yeah.
How is it going to work with the approximations? Are we even going to be able to implement it? I'm worried about we're going to get, we can't actually do that. So we're just going to make these other changes, and we're going to have people failing all the time, even when we know that when we look at the data afterwards, they shouldn't have failed. So I'm looking at it. I want to know exactly what we're going to be able to do and what we're going to be able to implement before saying it's a great idea, because I'm worried about we're going to get some parts implemented and other parts not.
Yeah, I think we shared that concern in earlier iterations of the policy development about how this could be implemented, how the load serving obligation adjustment could be implemented, and the accuracy of that. So it's a good point, and definitely something else to think about. And I'll pass the mic there. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Adam.
I can't see on my screen in this new format whether anybody's got their hand up, Silas. So can you tell
Nobody
us?
does. We're
Nobody and
Okay, can you put up Jim then? Let him go. We got 15 minutes. We can at least get through yours.
Okay. So the genesis of this brief presentation is something that had been going through my head for a while as this whole initiative has been going on. And I think in one of our smaller meetings, I just started asking the question, and I realized that I wanted to inject some thoughts into the broader stakeholder process, which may have been considered, but to my knowledge have not been sort of really seriously poked. So next slide. So my understanding is that, you know, and we're on we have pricing enhancement. It was market power mitigation, we spent a lot of time talking about. I'm on the scarcity pricing branch now. And I'm going to be overly generalized, but basically my take of, or my understanding of the process has been that it's largely emphasized the mechanisms for, you know, increasing prices as the market approaches scarcity. So either through new reserve products or this new capacity margin concept, and the role of FRU that's floating in the background is important in this too. And it's really kind of like how and when to raise prices has been sort of the focus there. And they're complicated. There's arguments in favor of having a smarter way of doing it. But that's sort of, I think, slowed things down because there are all these implementation issues. Whereas my sense was, outside of the discussion of vol, and this is what one meeting, I basically just said, have you just looked at raising the scarcity penalty values? Or, you know, basically it would have to be a series of coordinated penalty values, but, you know, starting with the power balance constraint, which is kind of as close as this market's definition to scarcity as it gets. And it, you know, we violate it without necessarily shedding load, that, you know, we should be at least simultaneously re-examining the penalty values that are applied within the current market design. It's certainly something that could be implemented, you know, much more straightforwardly because we already have all the mechanisms for triggering those penalties. It's really just a matter of what parameter we use. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the PBC penalty is, you know, we always have to do 1,000/2,000 because sometimes it's 1,000 and sometimes it's 2,000 when these 831 trigger conditions maintain. My memory of the 831 process was the CAISO originally proposed just raising the scarcity value to 2,000 or the PBC constraint value to 2,000 during all periods, but this was eventually rejected by an interesting coalition in favor of the current sort of conditional increase that links the increase in the bid cap to the penalty value. And, you know, people have pushed back on, I don't know what the right comparison is here, but it's worth pointing out, you know, depending on how far back you want to go, $1,000 penalty price in 2010 is like $1,500 today. And so it's been $1,000 in some markets for even longer than that. And, you know, we don't really think about that relative to something. And, you know, another comparison, maybe fair, maybe not, is that the upper tier of the increasing block tariff during peak in PG&E territory is over $500 a megawatt hour now. And so if we're thinking of value of lost load, well, people are paying that every day. And they're maybe hopefully behaving a little more efficiently, but, you know, $1,000 doesn't seem so high anymore. It's like retail prices during some kind of critical peak periods exceed that even in parts of California. So, you know, thinking about that value, I think it is time to, you know, to revisit that again. We've often linked these to bid caps, and there's arguments, we'll talk about batteries in a minute, but, you know, they don't have to be. And so if we're worried about the FERC, you know, 831 and prudency stuff, you know, they're not they don't have to be linked. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to throw a couple considerations out here that I'm not sure have been like discussed enough. I haven't followed the whole proceeding, so maybe there have been parts. But my sense is like when people talk about the penalty value or scarcity values and talk about how high to set the penalty, they're really focused on missing money and the impact on investment incentives and so forth. And that's where differential approaches to resource adequacy, become relevant if you're thinking about long-run incentives. But there are several considerations that I think haven't gotten as much attention that are increasingly relevant to the operation of the market. Forget about long-run investment, but just the operation of the market. And just I think non-exhaustive list here is the storage resources, where we've continually worried about resources draining their energy too early in the afternoon, because when the price hits $850 at like 3 p.m., the incentives to hold it for the possibility of it reaching $1,000 4 hours later is not particularly strong. I know there are other things at play there as well. And certainly changing this, just changing the scarcity value wouldn't necessarily solve all of this on its own. You have to think about bid cost recovery elements. You have to think about the ability to bid an opportunity cost. So this is wrapped up with other storage in issues, but certainly this is really highlighted for me the fact that within a day, the penalty value is really important for trying to figure out the optimal deployment of some resources. Then as far as imports, and this goes back to August of 2020, where we had that ICE contract at $2,700 for or was it $1,700? It was well over our PBC constraint for a 10-hour block. And that's, just signals that there are entities out there willing to pay more than our PBC constraint for energy when things are really tight. And we have to think about how we, want to compete for scarce resources in the broader West during tight conditions. And then when we think about a lot of the stuff that we've had issues with over, that we've had to work through the last 4 or 5 years, there's an element of we're just not able to clear the market and therefore we have to use other mechanisms like priority versus non-priority exports or, other things. One example of this is the debate over wheeling services, where if we had higher scarcity values, the cost of wheeling would become much higher because you'd say, for example, it'd be 0 at the import constraint and then it would be really high on the export constraint. And that just raises the differential and the marginal cost of wheeling. And maybe that would relieve that pressure to try to use resources within California. And then there's the continuing emergence of demand side options, which we are sort of truncating as well. So last slide. And so, just trying to inject into the discussion here the fact that I think yes, I hear the argument that we're about to introduce a bunch of new stuff in EDAM, and there was sort of the experience when EIM first went live where we hit the PBC a bunch of times in the first month, as I recall. And so getting some live experience with EDAM, maybe should come first. However, that doesn't mean we should just sort of freeze penalty prices until we've worked out a mutually acceptable kind of redesign of how we should do scarcity values. I think we could start increasing them, and they don't have to be jumped up to some much, much higher level immediately. We could sort of step them up over time. And that way, there's also counter arguments in terms of, well, we've locked in this or that contract and now you're going to be devaluing it or that's always going to be an issue when we make market changes, and it's an issue when, market conditions change as well. So phasing in over time, but at least getting started on this is something we should seriously, I think, raise the priority of. All right, thanks.
I mean, folks didn't anticipate that it would stay 1,000 forever, so I don't buy the contract argument, that's for sure. Thank you, Jim. Let's see. We have 5 minutes left. I know, Scott, you have some material, but let's ask if there's anybody in the audience who wants to hurl a question our way or make a comment. Steve.
want to touch on something, Jim, that you mentioned in that last thing, and that is in California, we've got resource adequacy. So some of the missing money is because of that. And, resource adequacy also provides a market power mitigation function in terms of its must offer obligation. I'm just wondering how that impacts, the different things, what the potential, what that means for the CAISO versus what it means for the EDAM market structures.
Okay, so I guess within CAISO, and I've heard this argument that, I guess one of the things I'm concerned about is the market is increasingly, because RA's gotten more expensive, the market is increasingly focused on contracting for RA exclusively and focus less on contracting for energy. And part of that maybe is just that the price of RA relative to, sort of the burden, the split of revenues tilted towards RA, I think, is starting to get skewed in a disturbingly RA heavy direction, and that might in part be a function of the fact that we've held these peak prices down for a long time, and so it's probably not the consideration you were asking about, but one thing I've been worried about is that the presence of RA is sort of causing people to worry less about contracting for energy, where I would prefer to see sort of a bundled contract. And I'm not deep in this, so I don't know. I've just heard anecdotally that this is potentially something to think about. Now, outside, might there be more market power, and is that a reason to not raise the PBC constraint? I guess we're doing a lot in the to prevent a theoretical problem with market power, and I don't know if that should be the dominant concern here. We've been talking about doing mitigation in these areas. They could, there's much more scope for physical withholding, I guess, but at least in the EIM areas that don't have a must offer. But I don't think that in itself, absent evidence that there's a real serious problem with market power outside of California, is a good reason to not start on this road.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
One thought on the scarcity pricing and so forth is to remember that a lot of this applies to the California balancing area. Other balancing areas can contract for capacity outside the market. They show a price signal with their checkbook. The California ISO buys it in the market, and if we don't set that high price signal, we won't get the imports. And so, and maybe we don't need them. If we don't need them, we'll never have to pay that price. But if we do, then we got to worry about if other people are just going to write the check, as Jim said, and we have an artificially low price signal, we're not going to get it.
Yeah, and I'll say, I think California, the policy establishment has signaled a higher willingness to pay than $1,000 for scarce energy through a bunch of different actions, like a strategic electricity reserve. And I think having an option to just sort of pay the market price for scarce energy when you really need it is probably going to be overall less costly than some of these other actions we've been taking to try to work around that.
Yep. And we have some history. There's reason to expect that it will happen again. That there'll be games of musical chairs, and we'll be the one without the chair. So it is 7:29. I think it's time to conclude. And so I want to thank everybody in the audience. There are about 40 or so of you for sticking with us for this time period. We don't have another meeting scheduled, but there are a lot of issues on the plate, so I'm sure there'll be something soon enough. And there's a possibility of an in-person meeting sometime in the next couple of months, and so it would be great to see some of you there. So with that, unless anybody else wants to add anything, if there's any further business, I think we can end, Silas.
All right. Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. With that, our call is concluded, and you may now disconnect.